If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who encountered a cryptid, creature, stick Indians, etc., whether you are a hiker, camper, trucker, tell us your true encounter stories on this spooky day. When I was a young adult, I saw something terrifying in the countryside in Denmark. A good friend and I were about to go from his place to my place when we spotted something on the edge of a forest. It was a tall figure, about 2 meters tall or more. Long, skinny arms and legs. It didn't do anything, it just stared at my buddy and me for some time and then retreated to the forest. A couple of weeks later, my sister and her boyfriend saw the same thing, not far from where I saw it. They were taking our dog for an evening walk, and suddenly it appeared about 30 meters from them. Again, just staring. The dog began to whimper and flee with the tail between its legs, then they ran home and locked the doors. About a week later, we found a mutilated deer on our farm. The abdomen was torn or ripped open, and the guts were all over the place. The biggest predators we have in this part of the country are foxes and badgers, and I don't think they can attack and do that to an adult deer. Shortly after, my whole family moved. Some to another farm, others to a semi-large town. I myself am living in the town now, but I swear, sometimes I still have the feeling that I can see it in the dark. I am not entirely sure what I would call the cryptid I encountered, but my best guess is what the local Ojibwe refer to as Mamegwesi. A child-sized creature covered entirely in long hair. What I saw resembled Cousin It from Adam's Family, sans the sunglasses, with glowing yellow eyes. According to the Ojibwe, Mamegwesi only shows itself to children and medicine men. My friend and I were about 8 years old at the time, and we were coming back to my house after trekking through the field behind it. Coming up the path, we noticed a, less than 4 foot tall, person in what looked like a ghillie suit trying to figure out how to climb up onto the small, barn-shaped shed's roof. We startled it because it whirled around abruptly as if it were a frightened animal in the forest. It had no face that I could see, only long hair and glowing yellow eyes. I was a fanatic of the paranormal as a child, and my friend was as intrigued as I was, but it immediately darted to run around the right side of the shed, and I didn't hesitate to give chase. I wasn't afraid. I wanted to know what the hell I was seeing. My friend flanked the other side of the shed, and when we rounded the corner, it was nowhere to be found. It's the only cryptid I can say with stark certainty that I know is real, but I will say that I have never seen another since then. My friend and I were at the lake late at night, trying to signal aliens with a flashlight. We did see one shooting star, but no UFOs. Not too long into the shenanigans, both of us started to feel really off. We weren't old enough to really know what true, primal dread was, but now we know that's what we felt. Just like the mountains were about to crash down and suffocate us, the lake swallowed up any trace of evidence. Everything felt like a serious threat. We heard a noise and turned our flashlights towards the abandoned train bridge to the right, not actually expecting to see anything. But there was some tall, long, bone-thin, gray, lanky-limbed mother ducker running across the bridge as fast as the quads ripped down it. In other words, way too fast to be possible. It almost ran faster than our beams could keep up with a couple times. The end turned off into old, obscured tunnels, so we lost sight of it right away. The whole time it ran, it clicked. We immediately, obviously, lost our shit and ran back to my cabin, hearing things in the bushes the whole way back. For over a decade, we were convinced we had somehow conjured an alien, I know. It was only after learning about cryptids that we realized what else it could have possibly been. I almost wish it was E.T. 23 years ago, my little sister and I went for a bike ride in Burnt Hills, New York. We decided to go to Indian Meadows Park because this area is a hidden gem with secret bike paths. We biked to the very back of the park, where there is a hidden path that leads straight to a little creek. We hopped off our bikes and pushed our way into the overgrowth in search of the path. We located the path, but before we could hop back onto our bikes, I saw a tall, deathly white thing with elongated arms and legs hop up from the ground and into the lower branches of a nearby tree. From that branch, this creature leapt effortlessly from tree to tree, making its way closer to us. Needless to say, the shock gave way to straight fear and panic, and we booked it out of there. I believe what I encountered was the rake. It was a clear afternoon of fun with my little sister that took a WTF turn for the worst. Driving home from work in a pub at 3 a.m. The middle of the town is a massive park. This park was dark at the best of times, pretty much a daytime park only. As I am driving past this park, out of nowhere, this animal, assuming it is an animal, gallops out of the shadows and collides with my car door. I hit the brakes and stopped. I look up, and a humanish face stares me down, covered in fur. I shit myself, figuratively, and get out of there at top speed. I get home 5 minutes later and get my dad. He looks at the side of the car and finds hair and a massive dent. I go to the police the next day and report the incident. No one reported the incident, and no hospital admissions were reported in line with this over the following days. We get the hair tested, it is canine. The entire thing still gives me the shakes. I was on a hike on a Tuesday morning in North Van. I found my way down to the rocks by the river with my friend, and I'm looking out across the river, and I see some dude walking around. I said out loud to my friend, "Oh, look, there's someone else down here on the rocks," because I thought it was funny. We had made quite an effort to get through the bush and down the boulders and stuff. My friend isn't seeing who I'm pointing to, so I keep trying to show them, and I keep saying aloud what's happening. The dude walks a bit more, turns to his side, and now it looks like a big black dog on all fours, and then it walks out of view. The thing is, it was way too big to be a dog. And it definitely wasn't a bear, it was too skinny, and it had a long tail as well. We hiked up to the point where I saw it, and with the layout of the trails, it would have been hard for us to miss anyone leaving the area. We did see a woman with her dogs, but I asked her if they had gone down to the rocks, and she looked at us confused and said not at all. So, I don't know. My dad is a straightforward, logical guy. He's always been very skeptical about anything paranormal, and I've honestly never seen this man afraid. He's a chemical engineer who grew up on a farm in Cuba, and there's one strange event that happened to him back on that farm that still gives him goosebumps anytime he talks about it. My dad lived in a small town smack dab in the middle of Cuba. His father was a farmer, so my dad spent most of his time outside of school helping with the crops and animals. One day he was working pretty far out in the fields by himself, nothing out of the ordinary. It was late, and it was getting too dark for him to see much, so he decided to head back home and call it a night. About halfway there, he suddenly smells a horrible stench he described as something rotting, like a dead animal. This was odd because he hadn't seen or smelled anything earlier when he took this path to go out there, but he didn't think too much of it. That was, until the silhouette of a strange creature started making itself clearer. Note that by this point, it was pretty dark out, and the only light was that of the moon, so visibility wasn't great. The stench got worse and worse. Confused, he got closer to the creature until he was right upon it. And he was extremely puzzled by what he was looking at. He described it this way: it was as if you took two moose, sliced them down the middle vertically, and pushed the two end pieces together. Its legs were inverted, and it had hooves. It was standing perfectly still, so much so that my dad couldn't tell if the thing was even breathing. He walked a circle around it and saw no head and no open wound to indicate there was ever one. Suddenly, its belly started to glow, and my dad heard what he described as various indecipherable whispers. This was when his fight or flight finally kicked off, and he bolted away and ran the rest of the way home. He barely slept that night, and once the sun was out, he went back to see if it was still there or if there were signs of it, but there was nothing. My grandfather said he never saw the thing, but he had seen other inexplicable things on that farm, so he wholeheartedly believed my father. To this day, it freaks him out to think about, and he has no idea what it could have been. It's a cloudy afternoon. I'm walking through the local forest with my dog, as I do almost daily. I'm about 12 years old, or so. I came across some local schoolmates fishing around a bonfire on the river bank. I pull up a stump and join them. Just an average weekend afternoon. My dog runs off down the riverbank path, chasing after some. I didn't think much of it, but a few minutes had passed, and I went to check on him. As I head down the path, all of a sudden, the atmosphere completely changes. Time seems to slow down. My vision all around me is skewed. The wind stops, and sound ceases. Everything is dead quiet. My dog literally freezes in motion. I am able to move, but in molasses-thick, slow motion. Then, I saw it, climbing right out from the river onto the river path. Is this creature? It resembled an Akita-type dog crossed with a bear. It was around 12 feet long or so, and its skin was patched with fur and bare black or blue skin. And the smell, the stink. The most pungent, intoxicating, esoteric aroma that I've ever smelt. It was unearthly. It smelled like prehistoric moss or something. This odor was so palpable, it seemed to make the air sticky with moisture. It completely dominated the atmosphere. This massive, hulking, prehistoric-looking creature eased out of the river, dripping with water, and lumbered ahead down the path, towards a figure in the distance. By the time I was able to turn to look to see who or what the figure that was beckoning this creature to join them was, the sequence was over, and reality ensued. This actually happened to me, and it's been weighing on my mind as of late. Once, I was walking down my road with my dog on the driveway, bringing down my garbage bin. The reason I bring my dog is because I always feel watched, as though someone or something is going to jump onto me. I was walking down, and right at my gate, there is a sensor to detect if a car is coming down my driveway to get out. My dad and I usually walk onto this sensor to make the gates open. I remember I went to walk over the sensor, and I saw my dog perk his ears and look at the gate. I turn my head, and I notice a figure. My eyesight is poor at a really far distance, but all I saw was a white creature. It was hunched over, its arms hung down, and it looked almost skinny. My dog didn't really react, he just watched the thing slowly move behind the gate and out of view. I was, however, scared shitless. I grabbed my dog by the collar so he would be by my side and walked down the path very quickly, putting the garbage bin on the little private street we're on. Before me and my dog ran as fast as we could up the driveway. When I was a kid, I had a weird experience that only happened to me once. I was having issues sleeping, so I looked out my window like I normally do to help me fall asleep. Outside was a plain area of land next to a wooded area with just one tree in the center. A deer figure was there. At first, it looked just like a normal deer, but I was confused because it was a pretty populated area and normally deer aren't around there. I looked back out the window and noticed the figure getting closer. At this point, I noticed something was pretty off because it looked very human. It was very tall and looked just like a human, but with a deer-shaped head and antlers. There were beads hanging from the string on both antlers. This scared me, so I hid under my covers. I was brave enough to look outside again, and once again, it got closer. This repeated itself over and over until it was next to my bed. I was so scared that I hid under my covers and never came out till the morning. When it was next to my bed, its head almost touched the ceiling. I will never forget this because it freaked me out so bad. A buddy of mine is Mormon and served a mission down in New Mexico. Part of his mission covered a reservation. He was told numerous times not to come around preaching. So he would just come around to help people. He'd do work for free, cleaning up things, volunteering time for people to get things done with their homes, etc. One night he fell asleep around 10 p.m. and said he immediately sat up around 2 a.m. He looked over to see a man standing in his window. He froze as the man walked around his home. He was living in a trailer. There was a knock on his front door. He could hear running, then the man reappeared in the window and hit the window as he ran by. The sound of his steps and the time between knocks were getting faster and faster. He said it got so close that it was almost a continuous knock. All at once, it stopped. The guy was gone. My buddy and his missionary companion just sat there the rest of the night and didn't dare go back to sleep. They took it as a warning to stay away, and they did. He had heard rumors of other missionaries getting threats and seeing guys run next to cars on the highway, but he never saw that or had evidence. Years later, we were at a party, and one of my close friends is Cherokee. I turned to my missionary friend and told him to tell my Cherokee friend the story. My Cherokee friend got really quiet and asked my buddy not to even start. He said the more you talk about skinwalkers, the more they come around, and he seemed very uneasy that night and mentioned he hoped he wouldn't feel them. The way he was so serious about it gave me the creeps. In maybe 2007 or so, my wife and I were driving home from her dad's birthday party in South Florida late one night. She was very drunk, so I was driving her car. We took the shortest route through some back roads near a large farm and saw something in the road ahead of us just after making a right turn. It was a light gray color, and its head was high enough to be about level with mine in the driver's seat, so maybe 3 to 4.5 tall, I guess, while presumably standing. It was in the right lane, just shy of the center of the road, so I went around it fairly slowly. As we did, it turned its head and kind of came towards our vehicle and got very close to the passenger window. I would say it was less than a foot from my wife's face. It had huge black or very dark colored eyes and a head that was kind of valve-shaped. We both got a glimpse of it before I stomped on the gas and got the duck out of there. I'd always assumed it was a big owl. I've seen some huge ones while hunting in Mississippi in my youth, but I'm unfamiliar with the species in Florida. Years later, we went to a community event where an owl rescue group was present. They had rescued owls of every species natively found in Florida on display, which was really cool, but none of them were quite that tall or that color. The closest was the barred owl, but the color didn't really match, and while they can get pretty tall, I don't think they're as tall as what we saw. I described it to the owl people, and they felt that the height ruled out an owl. I live on the Navajo Nation on the Oz/NM border. It was the first snow-delayed school day of the year 2021. I saw a group of young people talking in the parking lot next to the high school, waiting for the delay. When the group dispersed and started walking towards the school, one person out of the group started walking in the opposite direction of the school. They then put their hands out towards the ground and leapt forward with their arms extended, like they were about to do a tumble roll. When they hit the ground, it was a dog in full run. I'm looking at a person in mid-stride, then morph instantaneously into a running dog. Yeah, indigenous dog children, the skinwalker, I'd what I saw. All I know is that I saw it. This all happened when I was younger, maybe 13 to 14. Me and two of my buddies lived right next to some woods, and being teenagers, our first instinct was to go back there and build shit. The main area that we would go down to was technically private property, but the owner allowed people to walk on it like a nature trail. Despite being sandwiched between two neighborhoods, the woods were pretty dense. We had our most recent fort on the side of that stream, and the trail to get to it cut through some of the denser parts of the woods. Anyway, we were walking down to the fort one day, and we heard what sounded like someone hammering at the fort. We just expected it to be some of the older kids being assholes, so I told the other two to go up to the other end of the trail because I was going to go the long way to see if I could see what was making the noise. I start heading down the longer path, and as I'm going, I stop a couple times to listen to the hammering, and I notice that it sounds like something is walking in the woods to my left. I did it a couple more times, and it started to stop when I did. I got to the fort finally, and lo and behold, no one was there. As I started walking back to get back to the other two, I looked into an opening in the woods to my left and saw what looked like a burnt out oak log. I had a BB gun with me, and for whatever reason I raised it at the log, and the thing turned a head and looked at me. I don't really know how to properly say it, but it had a head and turned to look at me. I shot at it and just booked it out of there. My friends saw me running out of the trail and started to run, and we didn't stop until we got out. They asked what happened, and I told them what I saw, and the bastards believed me. I guess good friends go a long way. We went to check the area the next day, and the log thing wasn't in the clearing anymore. Those woods are weird as hell, and I've had more weird shit happen there. I grew up north of Cincinnati, Ohio, in a town called Hamilton, Hamiltucky to the locals. It's a pretty nice area, but poor. It has been since most of the factories got outsourced back in the 80s and 90s. There are a lot of Scot-Irish people, which means they're one step removed from West Virginia indigenous personnel. In the last 20 years, this place has gone from a tiny city or suburb surrounded by woods and corn to a strip mall after a strip mall, and the area has been built up a lot. I mean, there's a business on every corner. So, when we were kids, we spent a lot of time in the woods around where we grew up. There are still some pretty big parks, but a lot of the woods are private property. A few older brothers had stories about creatures in some of these patches of wood. The first guy said he was out playing with a few friends in a decently sized patch of woods behind a regional airport. He was around 9 to 10 at the time. This would have been in the late 80s or early 90s. He said he was running and tripping on a rock or stump, and when he looked up, he saw a humanoid creature crouching behind a bush looking at him. I can't remember, but he said that it had yellow or green eyes and was covered in hair. He also said this thing had a bird face, and it never made a sound or moved. I just watched him and locked eyes for a few seconds before this guy got up and ran off. This creature, in our own little circle, became known as Owl Man. We used to scare each other in the woods growing up. We brought this up to this same guy, now in his 40s, and retold the story, which was dead serious. We've also heard stories from older guys that used to hunt in those same woods back in the 60s and 70s about seeing a Bigfoot type creature. I'm not sure if that's real or just a drunken story. Well, I was driving a friend's car. It was an old Jeep that he borrowed from me because my car was being repaired. I was driving on an old countryside road because I wanted to test the Jeep, so I didn't go on the usual road, I took another way. It was like a countryside road, so it has a lot of farm gates that I need to open to pass. In one of these gates, I was getting off the car when suddenly, behind the gate, walking along the fence, I saw a huge creature. It was like 9/8 feet tall. I couldn't see more because it was at night and it was a mountain in steep terrain, so the car headlight was pointing up. And I could see a white, tall, creepy creature walking. It didn't give a shit to me, it was like I wasn't there. I didn't see his face because, like I said, it was night and the flash of the car was pointing up, but the creature was too tall that I couldn't see his face. It wasn't like a Bigfoot, werewolf, or some kind of shit, it looked like a Slender Man. But it was all white, and it was wearing a wedding suit, like a Slender Man. From what I saw, I can say that it was like a surgeon or a butcher, but tall as duck and creepy as hell. I went back to the car and returned all the countryside roads to the casual road just to avoid this thing. I was so terrified. I live in a small border town along the tip of South Texas. About a week ago, my brother told me he saw something that has been making him question his sanity ever since. He's the type of guy who will get up in the middle of the night and check outside the house to see if everything is alright. Some of the neighbors have had some of their property stolen, so he likes to make sure all is well. According to him, it was around 3:15 a.m., and he heard a chorus of dogs barking loudly and aggressively down the alley behind our house. So, he gets up, walks down the hall, and stares out the back door window while facing south. After gazing out the window for about 5 minutes, he swears he saw what he can only describe as a combination of a humanoid-type figure with the head of a wolf-looking animal dart down the alley in a flash. He describes being able to see its ribs protruding through its skin. As it ran, he said it looked like it was bending over with its palms flat on the ground, kind of like the way someone would bend down to touch their toes if they were stretching. He added that it didn't really look too hairy but appeared to have human skin, all while possessing a translucent white/smoke color all around it. Even as it was hunched over, he said it was about 5 feet tall and 5 feet long. The following day, he told my parents about it, and they happened to mention it to one of the neighbors. It turns out that a few days before my brother's sighting, their boxer had been stolen from their backyard. Instead of thinking my parents and my brother were a bunch of kooks, the lady neighbor, whom we found out came from a Native American background and whose Native American mother had given her the dog as a gift, told my parents it was probably what Native Americans refer to as a skinwalker and that it was probably looking for her stolen dog. She also mentioned that whoever stole the dog was probably cursed by now. I know this story sounds bizarre, but unfortunately, I don't have any pictures or any other type of evidence to present to you all. My family and I have all witnessed and experienced some sort of supernatural or paranormal instance at some time or another. In 1999, I was 7 years old and playing in the woods with my friend Charlotte. We were standing at each end of a big log in the woods when I noticed movement in my peripherals. I tried focusing my periphery to catch a detailed look. I see similar movement often when we're in the woods, and it always disappears, more like scatters, before I turn to look. My heart skipped a beat when I could make out a group of little people looking up at me as well. I was frozen in the pose I was playing in, and after a few seconds, I realized Charlotte had stopped narrating the play and was frozen in place as well, staring at me but focusing on them. I'm pretty sure they were dressed because it didn't look like they were all naked. I could tell they knew we were aware of them, and they dispersed as Charlotte moved her eyes. We didn't talk about it until we were in her house. We weren't afraid, just confused on our walk home. We wrote out what we saw before talking about it to see if we saw the same thing. Unfortunately, both our descriptions were so vague, but clothed, less than a foot for sure. One thing we were positive of was to mind our business and not go searching, which is what our instinct would have usually been. We thought we found a colony of little people in the woods. But the fact that our reaction was to quietly leave and not even talk about it until behind closed doors, and still not even talk out loud but write it. I don't remember being too frightened. In fact, we kind of just accepted it and moved on with a new taste of what this world and universe are capable of. I watched The Indian in the Cupboard later in life, which reminded me of these little people, but I no longer saw them by then. Charlotte and I would talk about seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, but we could never figure out what they were. Although Charlotte was different, she and her dad were huge hippies, tire swing in the kitchen, no TV, and her imagination was so wildly magnificent that it made my mind radiate. I always thought that maybe her narration of our play was so powerful and energetic that we could manifest and see the same thing. Little people were never playing any part in either of our imaginations. In fact, when we both confirmed what each other saw, we were kind of in awe that we've never even dreamt of tiny people in this universe. So I live in a pretty rural area in Michigan close to the lake, and I am currently living alone. Both my parents are currently in Canada, taking care of my great uncle, who is in his late 80s. They have been gone for a month or so and probably won't be back until late December. I am 19 years old, so I am more than old enough to be alone. But some really odd things have been happening in the last 2 weeks, so it started back in September when my 15-year-old cat Gingersnap went missing. At first, I figured she had passed away since she was very old and had a few health problems already. And a few days later, I found her body completely torn to shreds on my back porch. I mean, she was severely mutilated to the point where I threw up while sobbing hysterically. I came to the conclusion that I must have been a bird of prey since we have so many big owls and hawks where I live. A few days passed, and on October 4th, something odd also happened. I was watching TV around 11 p.m., and I kept hearing a really fast knocking sound. It would come in sets of 5 and then stop for a second, then restart. I ended up going outside to investigate, and I couldn't see anyone, but there was a really horrible smell. Then what happened last night? So I had woken up at like 3 a.m., which happens sometimes if I have a really messed up dream. So I walked down the hall to get a drink and probably watch TV. When I got to the fridge, which is right next to the back porch door, I heard someone walking around. I froze up, coming and staying completely still. I looked over to the door and saw a huge shadow. It was kind of crouched on his hands. I don't really think it saw me, but it looked human. It didn't move for like a whole 3 minutes before the shadow moved in the blink of an eye, and it was just gone. I ran back to my room and called the cops. When they got there, they couldn't find anything, but they told me there was no one there since our back porch is suspended about 15 feet in the air and there was no ladder. I am super freaked out, especially since I am completely alone up here. This isn't my story, but my grandma's. My grandma's family, I swear, has something that follows them, or they're cursed or something. All kinds of strange things have happened to my grandma, grandpa, and my dad. I'm sure things probably happened to my grandma's siblings and parents too. Her father was a police chief and an alcoholic when they were growing up, so I wonder if he's the start of it all. Anyhow, this is, as far as I know, the first thing she ever experienced. I can't remember her exact age at this time, but I'm thinking 5 to 6. She had stayed home from school one day, not sure why exactly, but she was the only child at home. Her mom was upstairs, putting some laundry away. Well, my grandma was down the stairs coloring at the kitchen table, and behind her was one of the bedrooms with a door pen. So my grandma is just chilling and coloring, and she starts hearing someone jumping on the bed in the bedroom behind her. She's scared at this point but tries to ignore it. The jumping goes on for a minute, then all of a sudden there's a loud thud. Whatever had been jumping on the bed had jumped off and was now just standing there. My grandma sat there for a second and eventually got the courage to turn around. She turns, and she sees this small, maybe 2-foot creature, she called it a gremlin, standing there. She said it had grayish skin and a cloak type thing, so she couldn't see its face. She said it felt evil. Terrified, she bolts up the staircase. As she runs up, she feels like something is pulling her back. She doesn't look and just keeps pushing to get up the stairs. As she rounds the corner to the second half of the staircase, whatever was released to her, she made it to the top and ran to her mom, started crying, and wouldn't leave her side the rest of the day. She wouldn't even talk about this for the longest time because she was afraid it would come back and get her. She only told me about it a few years ago, and she was hesitant even then. I was driving home last night and saw something that freaked me out. It was like midnight, and I was only about 5 minutes away from my house, a pretty small town with no streetlights, when I started to drive past the graveyard, and all of a sudden something sprints out in front of my car and then disappears since it's so dark out. I only really caught it for the last second because I was so surprised and it was so fast. It was long-limbed, upright, and a tan color. At first, I thought it was a deer based on size and color, but it definitely had 2 legs. Then I was like, well, maybe it was a deer or mountain lion or something that was leaping, so it just appeared to be on 2 legs, but I only really glimpsed it when it would have been landing from a jump, not starting a jump. Then I thought maybe it was some creepy human streaking, but it was way too fast and also, I think, too big for that. I am a biologist, so I have literally been through every scenario to try to explain this rationally, and I just can't. The best way I can compare it is if that monster from Stranger Things was beige or tan instead of gray, like that body shape or size, though I didn't see its face because by the time I really saw it, it was facing away from me across the road. It just made it extra creepy that it was next to a graveyard and only a few minutes from my house. This is in Massachusetts. A couple years ago, me and my mother were driving back home on a late Sunday afternoon. We turned down our dirt road, which was pretty long and narrow, when suddenly something flew directly in front of the car from the right and disappeared into the forest to the left. We both audibly said, "What was that?" at the same time. Below is the description of the creature. It was slightly larger than our car, which was an old red Kia. It had large, wide wings and was completely covered in fur or feathers, but it more closely resembled fur. It had 4 legs separate from the wings, the 2 front ones as eagle talons, and the back ones resembled crocodile legs if they were furry and not scaly. It had a very long, thin tail that tapered into a spade or arrow-like projection on the end. The tail was not furred. Its head resembled that of a lion with no mane but had features as if you mixed a lion's head with that of a Chinese dragon-esque head. The fur was light brown on the bottom and a darker brown on the top. After witnessing this thing flying across our road, directly in front of us, we sat in shock for a while before slowly driving all the way home. If anyone has any form of answer for what this was, I'd love to hear it, because as a wildlife biologist in training, it has really been bugging me for years. This happened in central Mississippi. The events that I'm about to describe happened in the poorest and most mysterious region of rural Spain, Extremadura, more specifically in the Comarca, county, of La Vera. The year was 1948. In this context of extreme poverty and despair, a simple man, a semi-nomadic goat herder living in the pueblo of Garganta la Ala, struggled to make a living out of the land. This land on which he lived was fairly fertile during the colder months of the year but extremely dry, hard, and dusty during the hotter ones, in which the temperature rose to 45 ok. In order to be able to feed his big black horned Verada goats, this shepherd was forced to walk long kilometers during long, warm days looking for green pastures and brush up in the Tormentos Sierra mountain range, which was not fairly far away from his pueblo. This meant that, of course, Don Jose was forced to sleep wrapped in his manta in between his dogs next to a fire and directly under the shine of the stars. This was one of those nights. As he himself would tell the villagers back home the next morning, he found himself preparing some migas out of dry bread and goat meat next to the fire under a moonless sky when it came, and it came from the night. It seemed to be a large figure, wearing a dark, thick, and wide cloak, with its head completely covered as well by a black hood, as it was traditional for the women in this time and place. This woman appeared, walking in between the shadows without making any sounds, and stood silently just at the edge of the firelight, moving around the herder while tilting its head some 45 to the right. Inverted question mark ¿Quién va? Asked Jose while holding his huge Mastin Español, an aboriginal livestock guarding dog breed, with his right hand. He started staring and tried to see the face that was hiding under that hood. Unsuccessfully. This simple man that we know as Jose had spent a lot of time eating scarcely and knew very well what hunger was. Figuring that this apparition might only be a hungry traveler, he invited it to share his meal. Immediately, the figure resumed its turning and, facing the shepherd, moved one step forward. By this time, the dog was freaking out, showing its immense fangs and growling from the bottom of its chest. A second step followed the first one, and by this time the shepherd seemed to be able to see a sinister glow under the hood that he would later describe as live coal eyes. And when the third step arrived, Jose gasped and said, Dios me guarde. May God save me, because at this very time, Jose was able to see what he recognized as deformed hoofs in the place where the being's feet should have been. This caused the creature to bend over and retreat while whispering unintelligible and terrible things into the night until it got swallowed by the shadows. The next morning, Jose Campo Pancho realized that all of his goats were dead. He bent over and prayed towards the sun, glorifying it and thanking it for its light and safety. Then he headed back towards his village and proceeded to tell every one of the villagers, some of whom are family of mine, what had happened that night. People say that after that, he was never the same. He started fearing everything and everyone and would scream and shout during the night. Soon he wouldn't even come out of his tiny stone house at the edge of the village. This situation went on for a couple of years until one day the village woke up to realize that he had died mysteriously during the night, with his corpse deformed into what was now a horrendous grin. As to what it was that he saw, well, who knows really? This is Extremadura, a land of mystery and magic whose night is full of horrors. I had the strangest encounter last night at my parents' house on the Shenandoah River. I'm not even sure how to explain this. About 2 weeks ago, around 11 p.m., I noticed an extremely unusual green, blue, or red flash of light while at a family river house on the Shenandoah. It was quick, and I noted the time I saw it in the general area. We spent Thanksgiving with my family, and we're back at the river from yesterday. My girlfriend and I decided we would be at our dock watching the area of the river that we saw it from. At around 11:12 p.m., she notices something that appears to be running down the river. I look up and see it, and I notice that it is a bird. A ducking huge dark bird, with a white outline or tips that were literally glowing, left a trail of the misty glowing smoke it was almost like a ghost or phantom. This thing shot down the river like a rocket. It was definitely aware of us because it veered to the right and started coming directly towards us. The bird dives into the ground, not the water, and totally disappears or dissipates like smoke into the air. We hauled our asses back up to our porch, and the story gets stranger. We watch lights, and what appears to be a star or fractal light sits in the middle of the river. Orbs of light start appearing or disappearing. My grandfather lives in the house next door. One appeared over his house several times. The orbs or lights all seemed to interact with each other, and something was up with the overall energy. I'd see one orb turn into a triangle and then go back to one. We had a fire pit towards the end of the yard that we had used early in the night. At this point, the fire was basically out, maybe a few coals or embers. All of a sudden, flames started erupting and spewing from the pit. As the fire burned more intensely, the star on the river grew brighter and more intense, like it was feeding off the fire. I noticed the lights throughout the neighborhood were odd as well. Any light that was on in the neighborhood, from any house or street lamp, was like a ducking spotlight. Every light was glowing so intensely, way brighter than usual. And of course, Our electronics started acting up. Flashlights are not working when we try to shine the light in one area, but if we just rotate our bodies to shine it in another direction, it works totally fine. I am positive what I saw was either a legit thunderbird or some sort of hologram or projection. It wasn't an owl or any other real bird, because real birds don't go up in smoke. This thing was massive in size, bigger than any bird I have seen. This thing looked like a phantom flying bird that was the size of a flying dinosaur. I will never be able to fully explain what I saw. I either saw the real deal or witnessed some sort of classified research experiment, or maybe a mix of both. Years ago, my father told me this story. One night, he was out on Lake Arthur in Moraine State Park on his pontoon when he looked up and saw two large red eyes the size of baseballs moving along the tree line. The thing is, he wasn't the only one who saw it. His brothers on the boat saw it as well. He says it went up into a tree and began jumping from tree to tree. He also said you could hear it snapping large branches. Then, after a while, it just disappeared. Apparently my mother was also out that night before my parents were together. She was with one of her boyfriends, and she saw it as well. Neither of my parents have seen it again. My dad nicknamed it Old Red Eye. I'm thinking it was something along the lines of the Mothman, but nothing bad happened there. He never got to see its body, but from the size of the eyes, he said it must have been pretty tall. Not me, but my uncle tells this story. He was out hunting deer in the Ohi Desert, which, if you haven't been there, is a very interesting place. This would be about 1975. It stands as the widest expanse in the lower 48 states without paved roads. It also looks completely flat until you try to cross it, when it reveals itself as a lot of little pits and hummocks. He was walking the land, looking for an easy meal, when, deep in a little hollow, he came across a shack. These are hardly unknown in that country. 49ers, silver prospectors, and just plain old squatters have built shacks all over Nevada since white people started crossing through. He figures he's going to take a look and slowly creeps down towards it, when he hears the loud howl. And at the door steps the biggest and onlyest gray wolf he's ever seen in the country, and he fixes an eye on him. They stare at each other for what was either eternity or one breath, and my uncle knows he's trespassing and slowly backs up. If that really was a wolf, and he is one of the people I would know to trust the difference, it was a relict or a migrant. There hadn't been a wolf recorded in that country in 100 years. I was about 15 to 16 years old and walking home from a friend's place at about 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning with the friend I was living with at the time. My friend was pushing a BMX, and we were just talking and laughing as we walked home. All of a sudden, we saw what looked like two very large greyhounds jump over a set of mailboxes at some flats, apartments, and land in the middle of the road. The mailboxes appeared to be about 1.5 meters tall and about 5 to 6 meters from the road. In the moment, I thought it was a little strange, but I kept watching them. What I witnessed at that moment was something I will never forget in my life. The two greyhounds as they ran down the road appeared to both stand up on their hind legs and morph into a much bigger, beefier being, which I can only describe as looking like a yowie, which I guess is the equivalent of a Sasquatch to our friends from America and other countries. These yowies both ran around a corner about 200 meters in the direction we came, and we both sat there dumbfounded. A few seconds later, we heard what sounded like a small female child scream in terror. Keeping in mind that it was 3 a.m. in the morning and there were no children out, we both looked at each other in horror. Without saying a word, I jumped on the handlebars on the bike, and he pedaled that bike nonstop all the way home, about 2 kilometers away. When we got home, we locked the doors, as we had no idea what we had just seen or if they had seen where we went. After a little while, I asked him to describe what he had seen to me, as I was in disbelief, and he explained the exact same thing I witnessed. That is probably the scariest thing I have ever seen in my life. My parents and I were coming back from a trip to Mexico some years ago when they saw a levitating person. We used to drive to and from our trips to Mexico, so we left that morning at around 4:30 or 5-ish. Anyway, there is a lot of desert around the part of Mexico where we go. It is very hilly too. But there are these small towns in between that we have to go through to get to the main roads. We were probably 20 minutes into our trip when I felt the car slowing down. I don't make too much of it since there are a lot of huge speed bumps around those parts. I was in the back seat playing on a DS when I looked up. My parents were both looking in an alleyway, trying to see something. I asked what it was they were looking for, and they described it as a person wearing a white robe. They said it was kind of like that thing E.T. was wearing at the beginning of the movie. Apparently, they had seen this person come down from floating in the air, they said. When she touched the ground, my parents said she jetted into this alley that was dimly lit and in view from the speed bump we were at. I saw the alley, and no one was there. There were no doors in this alley, no ladders, nothing. There's no way she could have run the whole thing. She just kind of vanished. There is a strong belief in witches down in Mexico, and my parents are both convinced that they saw a witch that morning. They're both from Mexico and have both run into paranormal stuff there, including witches. To this day, you can still see the awe in their faces whenever they talk about it. I think I saw a fairy. I was raised in a Scottish-Irish family in the States. We're loud, we drink, and despite never having seen one, leaving food out for brownies and pouring a bit of beer into the ground as a libation is a totally normal thing for us to do. My siblings and I were raised in a haunted house. I'm happy to share that story, if you like, and for my 13th birthday, I received an Ouija board with the following instructions. Do not ask if there is a God. Do not ask about heaven and hell. Do not ask about aliens. If you bring something into the house, you have to get it out again, and then you will be grounded. Love, Dad. Paranormal discussions and study were just straight up normal in my house. Snowmageddon, a few winters ago, I was invited to a blizzard party. You know, bring your best board games, some books, and a sleeping bag, and let's get snowed up together. My friend who hosted is a Wiccan and had all sorts of books to read on magic, ghosts, fairies, what have you. I picked up a book on fairies and read through different types of fairies, how to see them, etc. I thought it was an interesting read, but nothing I really wanted to pursue. Something must have stuck with me, though, because a weird thing happened the first night I was home. I had been asleep, and I woke up to something on the bed. Right around my knees, it felt like something made an impression, like a cat hopping up. I didn't have animals at the time, though, and I lived alone. And, of course, it starts walking up towards my face. Because, apparently, that's what scary unknowns always do after they land on your bed. I could move, but I didn't want to sit up. I just kept my eyes open and tried to stay calm. What I saw when it got into my sightline is not something I've seen before or since. I saw a little person, a little humanoid, dressed in black, long hair, about a foot high, taking impossibly large strides up my bed, beside my terrified body. It was slender, almost spindly, but well proportioned. I couldn't make out a gender, as it looked pretty androgynous, but I sensed it was male. I remember thinking that his facial features were as sharp as the rest of him. He did not look at me or acknowledge me in any way, he just went up over my head. I could feel it walking across my pillow. How I did not lose it then, I'll never know, and I heard something hit my bookshelf, like he jumped and landed. When I found the courage to turn the light on, there was nothing there. I don't know how to go about debunking this, but I can tell you that I had not been drinking, had not been meditating on the existence of the Fae, and was not suffering from sleep paralysis. I know that I was awake. I work at Walmart, and so I'm walking home at 11 p.m. This happened when I was going up to my house on my driveway, and it scared the living shit out of me. It was a long evening, and I took the bus home. I was walking up the driveway with my phone on loudspeaker, playing some Happy Owl City. I had my phone light on so I could see ahead of me, and I'm looking around my surroundings just in case. I turn my head to the left, which is where my pond is, and lots of frogs croak. Nothing. So, I turn my head towards the right, and I swear, for a second, the light shined on a figure that was standing maybe 2 feet away from me. Its shoulders were up to my head, and it was white as can be. It looked almost like skin and bones. It was as pale as you can imagine, and I bolted my way up the driveway. I have never been so afraid in my life. This second encounter is short and happened nearby, in the forest, when I was walking home. I was on the gravel path when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turn, and nothing is there. I've heard strange noises in the forest, and they may be animals, but I still can't ever explain the white figure. For reference, I'm 6 feet 5 inches, so this thing was maybe 7 or 7 feet 2 inches. It was tall. Okay, so the only experience I ever had with a creature or animal that I couldn't identify has been on my mind and a very vivid memory my whole life. Later, through a friend, we found out what we encountered, a Wendigo. This is what happened, about 8 to 9 years ago, when I was younger. Me and my friend went to hang out at a park close to his house. No one else was there except me and him, and this was my first time being here. There was a small pond, a baseball diamond with a fence, and a playground, all surrounded by deep woods. We live in the eastern United States. We decided it would be fun to get giant branches and draw stuff on the baseball diamond afterwards. We would bang the fence around it for like a couple minutes straight, and it was pretty loud from what I can remember. We then heard wind, but not usual wind, but the sound of wind gusting through the forest behind the pond. This was during the summer, if I remember correctly, and there was a lot of foliage, so it was hard to see into the woods clearly. We then heard something big, like a horse, but fast, running through the woods right behind the pond, but along the way, it seemed like it was running around it. I saw a big white creature seeming to be 7 to 8 feet tall and probably weighing at least 300 pounds. It sounded like a horse running, but lighter. It was super fast. I saw it through the pond weeds. It seemed to have fur, but I couldn't see its legs, head, or if it had a tail. There were too many trees and plants in the way. We dropped our sticks and ran to his house, which was in yelling distance, terrified. We told his family, and of course they didn't believe us. I haven't talked to him in years. My grandpa grew up in the hillsides near Huixquilucan in the state of Mexico in the 1960s. It was very rural during that time, and he lived on a large property with few neighbors. His family didn't have much money, so he would tend to his neighbor's cattle, who owned the property further up the hillside, to earn a few pesos. His neighbor would usually accompany him in rounding up the cattle near sunset to bring them back to the barn. One day, though, my grandpa said his neighbor got sick and stayed inside instead of accompanying him. This wasn't too out of the ordinary, as he had been doing this for a while and was trusted. Nearing sunset, he started herding the cattle and walking them back to the stables. When he did a count, he noticed that a cow was missing. Going back to look for it, he headed down the hill when he says he heard rustling and snapping in the dry corn fields. Thinking the cow had somehow gotten lost in the field, he called out to it. Emerging from the corn fields was what he described as a large black dog, and he says he was overcome with an overwhelming sense of dread. He immediately turned to run up the hill and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He said he turned around to look behind him, and the dog had transformed into a bipedal run chasing after him. His neighbor had heard him screaming and immediately opened the door to let him in. He told his neighbor and his family what had happened, and his parents no longer let him go back up there to tend to the cattle. A detail that stood out according to my mom's retelling was how vividly he saw the dog shapeshift into a bipedal run after him. After she finished telling the story, she told me she couldn't remember the name of these folkloric creatures. The shapeshifting detail stood out to me, so I showed her a picture of a dogman and a skinwalker, and she pointed out that the details described by my grandpa were closer to a skinwalker. My dad then remembered the name and said they called them nahuals in Mexico. Looking them up, I saw a striking crossover between Native American and Mexican folklore between these creatures. They are shapeshifting shamans that transform into animals, most often large dogs. Additionally, what was striking is that they don't see these creatures as something mythical or outlandish, but take them to be the truth and are supposedly well known in their area. My boyfriend and I just bought our first house in June on a lake about an hour northeast of Seattle, Washington. Our house is backed up right against the Cascade Mountains. We're pretty much the last bit of population before the mountains begin. About 30 yards from our driveway is a dead-end road that turns off the main lake road and goes back into the woods a few miles. There are a few gated Forest Service/logging roads that branch from this road. When we moved in, I was dog-sitting my friend's pit bull, Bella. She was about 70 pounds and a totally fearless brat. She was kind of aggressive with other dogs and even with some people, food handling, etc. I would walk her up the dead-end road pretty often while I had her because there were hardly any houses and no traffic. One day we were about 2 miles up the road and had come down a small hill onto a flat, treeless area where there was an old abandoned barn and a large field that the road cut through. There was tall grass on either side of the road. When we got to the area, Bella's tail went down, and she kept her head really low. She also started to look around and back behind us, just acting nervous, which was odd for her. As we were coming around a turn, about 100 yards in front of us was a logging road that went off the road and straight up a hill. It had a large gate just like this at the bottom to keep vehicles out. So I know how tall it is. The top bar of the gate comes to my chest, and I'm 5 feet 5 inches. What I saw still scares me to think about. Standing right in front of this gate was a huge black dog. It was standing broadside with its head low, and I'm almost positive it was looking towards us because I couldn't make out a snout or ears. I couldn't see a tail either, but it may have been lowered between its hind legs. The shoulder of this thing was higher than the top bar of the gate because it was blocking part of it from view. I stopped instantly and held Belle's harness so she couldn't advance forward anymore and catch sight of this thing because of aggressive dog problems. I looked at this thing for probably 2 seconds total before turning back and hauling us back up the road because I heard the thing growl. 100 yards away from it, and I heard the ducking thing growl this awful, almost hissing sounding growl. I was totally ducking terrified, and at this point, so was Bella. It was a long 2 miles back, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, and Bella was also freaked out the whole time. The growling, massive black dog wasn't the only thing I was so terrified of. I also had this awful feeling of fear and dread come over me when I saw it. It was overwhelming, and I'd never felt something like it. It took me a long time to feel okay and safe in our new house. Especially at night. Even now, I have a really hard time if I'm home alone. My boyfriend is 100% sure I saw a black bear. I did not see a bear. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania and have seen more black bears than he'll probably see in his entire life. This thing had long, skinny legs and a deeply curved ribcage and belly similar to a Doberman. Wolves don't live in this area, and even if they did, this would have been an abnormally large, skinny wolf. I'm from California, and way back when I was on the college search, I realized that I'd likely go out to the East Coast if I wanted to play field hockey. My mom and I organized a road trip through Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island to hit a bunch of different schools in a short amount of time. One of the schools was Ithaca College. It was a last-minute decision to stop there, so we didn't have much time to explore the general area afterwards. We had been told by multiple people that the waterfalls in the area were beyond gorgeous and worth the stop, so my mom and I decided to swing by one before we left for Pennsylvania. We put Ithaca Falls in our rental car GPS, and it brought us to this red curb loop and an old, run-down overlook of the falls. This overlook was down a hill and through some trees, so my mom didn't want to leave the car on a red curb. She encouraged me to go down and check it out on my own, and I did. The first time I went down, I was sure to be observant of everything around me. I didn't want any randos in the woods sneaking up on me. I went to the ledge and took some pictures, sat and listened to the water for a while, then turned to go back up. When I turned, I got this odd feeling as if someone was watching me or standing with me. I got uncomfortable and looked around, nothing appeared to be wrong. So I calmly headed back up the hill. I got in the car, showed my mom the photos, and realized I didn't take a video. My mom suggests I go back down to get a video, we've got time. So again, I do. The second time I go down, I feel a little less happy. I was down a slope, so my mom couldn't see me. I felt more alone and exposed than the time before, and that sinking feeling kept growing. I go to the edge and take the video with shaking hands. Now I'm feeling like I need to get out of there. Intense sense of urgency. I turn around to go back up, and some force stops me dead in my tracks. I'm frozen there, like a rabbit or a deer frozen in headlights. I literally cannot get myself to move forward or take a step. An absolutely overwhelming sense of dread sweeps over my body and presses on my chest. Just such dread. I literally feel like I'm going to die. I still can't move and sit there, terrified, as I feel a massive presence come up behind me. This thing felt big and so real, and yet I can't get away. I'm still stuck and helpless. I keep standing there, too scared to turn around, unable to move, when the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It bends down towards me, and right next to my right ear says "Yoo-hoo." I kid you not, when I heard that I ran faster than I have in my entire life. I tore up that hill, still too afraid to see what was behind me. I got in the car, slammed the door, and like a movie went, "Drive." My mom looks at me in disbelief and goes, "Is everything okay?" I say, "Just drive." She told me later that I was pale white and that the sense of urgency in my voice just told her she had to get away from whatever I was scared of. What spooks me so much about this story is that I never turned around. I felt so real that it could have been a person, but I was right against the overlook. I don't think anyone could have snuck up behind me, and I've also gotten that sense of dread visiting other haunted places. I really feel that it was something paranormal. As for the "Yoo-hoo," it didn't sound male or female. It did sound mean, however. As if it were trying to scare me or intimidate me. This is a really odd story about how I came to see a literal dogman. I live in a neighborhood, by the way, but we are on the edge of a large forest behind our house. So not completely rural. So, I set a live trap for a mouse last night, catch and release. I can't stand to harm mice. It triggered at midnight, and the loud pop of the door woke me up. So, I decided I'd just take him outside immediately. Instead of releasing mice in the yard by my house, I always go about 3 miles away into a forested area. I got into the car with a little cage, going down the street. It was literally only 1 block away from my home, and I instantly slowed on the brakes because of something enormous at the side of the road. At first, I thought, well, that's got to be the tallest dog I've ever seen. Its silhouette was blacker than the night. As I slowed my car from maybe 20 miles per hour to 10 miles per hour, it suddenly came out of the street light and walked across the street in front of my car. It wasn't running, but it wasn't going slow either. I suddenly realized it was no ordinary dog, but I knew it wasn't a bear either because it didn't have much of a belly. This was 3 to 4 times the size of a wolf, and so I can confirm it was not a wolf. What I saw looked like a humanoid. The head was distinctly whale-like and enormous. It literally looked like a giant wolf head. The being had jet black fur. As black as hair can get. The legs were lanky. My brain literally froze. Instantly, I began rationalizing, but it was fairly impossible to rationalize what I had just seen. The closest thing I can compare this to would be the werewolf from Harry Potter that Professor Lupin turns into. All I can think of is, how did they know? That's nearly identical to what this thing looks like, as it's hunched over and walking on all fours. It's horrifying. It was literally quite accurate, looking like that exact CGI rendering. On all fours, its backside is probably about 4 to 4.5 feet in height. The head is higher, easily reaching 5 feet. The humanoid aspect of it cannot be denied. You could tell that if it wanted to, it could have easily stood up on 2 legs. To continue. I slowly continued driving and quickly stared over to the left side of the road as I was passing to see where it had gone. I was able to see its silhouette in a bush, looking back at me and watching me pass. I didn't want to stop. I was scared. I went on with my mission to release the mouse, but I can tell you this, when I got home, I ran into my garage and shut that garage door as quickly as possible. I was panicked, truly terrified. When you know what you saw, you know what you saw, they always say. I also know my mind didn't just fill in the blanks or hallucinate this. In the summer of 2016, I was interning at a church in the small city of Mound, Minnesota. The city is basically out on Lake Minnetonka. Sometimes my wife would ride out with me if I needed to pick something up or get something done. This particular evening, I had to do something at the church quickly, so we ran out there. Afterwards, we decided to go on a walk. Now I don't remember exactly the road we were on, but I do vaguely. It was between the church and Dutch Lake, I'm fairly sure. We parked and got out of the car. There weren't many houses on this road. There was an older farmhouse with a barn up ahead of where we parked, and then what looked like a couple long driveways. The time was somewhere between 7:30 and 9 p.m. We locked the car and started walking and talking. After about 3 minutes or so, we were up at the farmhouse. This is where my wife saw something. In the middle of a sentence, she stopped. And I took a couple steps ahead. Then she asked me if I saw that with urgency. I turned my head to the yard in front of the farmhouse. What I saw was a stick figure looking thing. About 2 feet tall with arms and legs about 1 foot long. No features at all. It was a cloudy black color, striding across the yard smoothly. It started on the ground from where I saw it, and as it went, it gradually rose to be about 1 to 2 feet above the ground, still striding in the air. Then it just disappeared in front of our eyes, as if it went through a portal or something like that. In talking later on, we figured that from where she first spotted it, it traveled 50 feet, give or take. As soon as it disappeared, I told her we needed to get out of here. We felt this overwhelming sense of fear overcome us. We booked it for the car. I whipped a U-turn, and we got out of there as fast as we could. We sat in silence for a long time before we talked about what we saw on the way home. When one of us brings it up now, we are both uneasy about talking about the strong sense of fear that overcame us. I know the land around Lake Minnetonka and the lake itself have been inhabited for thousands of years by mound builders and then later on by the Mdewakanton tribe, who are a sub-tribe of the Isani Dakota, so maybe this thing we saw has a relation to these peoples. I'm not sure, honestly. So I grew up in an old house in the south, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. The house was laid out somewhat circularly, as you could walk from the living room through most other rooms just by walking in a complete circle and end up back where you started. When I was around 5, me and my younger sister were chasing each other in circles while my mom cooked dinner. I was in front of her, and we were laughing and carrying on. When we got into the dining room, in the inside corner, there was a small greenish creature with a dark cloak on. It had pointy ears that stuck out and sharp teeth. I was young, but it was still very small, so I'd say maybe 2 feet. It looked kind of like it had been at the bottom of a pond or something. Very old and tattered. It put its finger to its lips and was grinning. I slammed to a stop, and my sister was chasing so close that she ran right into me, which pushed us both around the corner into the kitchen. We both started screaming, and my mom ran to us to see what was the matter, but the thing was gone. This has haunted me for years. I'm 25 now, and although I've done tons of searching, I've never found anything that really fits what we saw. For a long time, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, and if it weren't for my sister also seeing it or my mom remembering our very real terror, I probably would have just written it off. There were a lot of weird things happening in that house when I was young. Disembodied voices, things moving, super weird dreams, but that was obviously the weirdest and most unsettling. My dad moved to the US from Nicaragua when he was 13. He told me of a story when my aunts and uncles stayed in this shack in the back of a house that my grandparents stayed in. The way he explained it, basically my grandparents stayed in a house and through the back door you'd get to my dad's and his siblings' little shack. The door they had 3 old school locks on it, the ones you'd have to slide, and he basically drew a short straw to lock up for the night. When he went up to lock the door, he perked through the crack, and what he told me he saw were 2 giant red eyes and big wings. It scared him shitless, and by the time he ran to tell everyone in tears, the creature was gone. I grew up in New Zealand. A very spiritual place. The land is extraordinarily lush and beautiful due to it being a very recently formed set of islands. As such, there is a lot of strong energy surrounding its nature, and the native people, the Maori, have an incredible connection to this energy. Many areas are considered tapu, which roughly translates massacred, and these are places you should not go without a spiritual elder of the Maori people. I was walking through a forest early one morning on my way home. It was about 1 a.m. The night was very clear, it was a full moon, and there were no clouds, so it was bright, but the woodlands were still dark. I knew the area quite well and always stuck to the path, but I had my headphones in and was listening to music, not concentrating on the pathway. I was making my way through a downward copse of sparse trees and dead stumps when I realized that I wasn't on the path anymore. In fact, I had jumped a fence without taking much notice and had ventured far away from the usual route. It had felt natural to do so, almost like I was being guided to the area, so I ripped out my headphones and stood still, immediately feeling uneasy. The moment I took my headphones out, I felt this sense of dread and uncomfortable energy wash over me. Having known the lay of the land, I realized I was in a cordoned-off area that led down to a particular part of a river, which I'd never been to before, and I knew that it was tapu to a local tribe. I stood still, feeling really out of place, and stayed quiet and listened. A few moments passed, then I heard a rustling in the bushes, the sound of something wet, large and heavy, dragging itself across the grass, and then the sound of a baby crying loudly in the night. It shook me so much that I couldn't breathe. I will never forget that sound. For those of you who have kids, it sounds like when a baby starts teething and they scream from the pain. It was garbled and shrill and almost bubbling, but it felt totally inhuman. The crying started getting louder and louder and coming closer to me up the hill, so I turned around and bolted as fast as I possibly could. I hoofed it up the slope into the fence, leaping over and taking off back down the path. I was shaking so much, and I could hear the sounds of wet, slapping things moving off in the distance in the bushes. That story has haunted me to this day, and I believe what I may have encountered was a taniwha, an ancient spiritual guardian of the land. Why are they crying? I didn't want to stay and find out. But I never went back to that part of the forest or down that slope again. I was with my boyfriend at the time in this really creepy, dark area, literally pitch black. The only people who lived there were weird sort of folk. They never ever saw other people, but we would see random stray dogs abandoned there. Just a bunch of trees that go on forever. This place is so desolate. Anyway, we were just messing around trying to catch EVPs and whatnot, when somewhere in the distance, we hear what sounds like this huge branch fall from the top of a really tall tree and crash to the ground. It was pretty far away, so we kind of ignored it. Whatever. About a minute later, we hear the exact same sound. Only a bit closer. My boyfriend started kind of getting nervous, but I decided it was still too far away and we didn't need to worry about it. So we shrugged it off, assuming it was a coincidence. The same amount of time passed when we heard it a third time, right at the edge of the clearing where the cemetery was. At this point, I decided it was kind of spooky, and I wanted to go. We made our way up this hill to where the car was parked, and we both noticed something reflecting off the beam from the flashlight. At first, I thought it was a beer can that was ripped in half or some sort of trash. As I got closer, I realized it was an animal. Very still, maybe a raccoon or an opossum, but we freaked it out and it wasn't moving. When we actually reached the car, we both immediately realized it was something else. I don't know what it was, but it had a long head, almost like a doe, but with sort of dog-like ears, like a pit bull with clipped ears. It also looked like it may have been fuzzy a bit, like very short fur, but it was a reddish-brown color. Just sitting there watching us. I instantly told my boyfriend to get in the ducking car, but he wanted to try to get a picture. I was so scared that I told him that I was going to leave his ass there, so he didn't get a picture. I sort of wish he had. I made him tell me what he saw on the drive home, and he described the exact thing I had seen, so I knew it wasn't my eyes playing tricks on me. Needless to say, we never went back. I sort of want to go back now, though. Me and a group of my friends went camping one spring break. We stayed for 5 days in a primitive spot. Overall, it was very fun. One day my friend found a rock that looked like it had an eye carved into it. The eye was very clear and deep, Not sure how it got there, though. He decided to keep it, and we pretty much forgot about it. Well, that night, he had terrible sleep paralysis. He heard children giggling outside his tent and felt something sit on his chest and breathe into his face. Later, we learned from my fiancé's coworker that the park we stayed at is apparently haunted, and she said she refused to stay there anymore because she saw the goat man. I'm not sure if it is, but it's definitely strange that that happened right after finding that strange rock. We have this old wives' tale from the locals about whenever thick fog forms along the ground. I never believed any of it. The story goes that when the fog forms, spirits are closer to Earth and can be seen walking. Considering we have a fort from the Civil War that was never used and several cemeteries from the 1800s, everyone is very skeptical. I was driving on a back road last week, and a thick fog rolled in. It's not uncommon for this to happen in early August. It was about 11 p.m. when I passed one of the cemeteries. About 1/3 of a mile up the road, I spotted a figure. There was a woman in a dark gray dress walking along a cornfield with a long braid full of ribbons. There were no farms around for miles. I passed because I've always been taught to be cautious around things like that. Out of curiosity, I turned my car around to see if someone was going to pick her up or if she was lost, but as soon as I pulled up near her, she took a sharp turn into the corn. I brushed it off, waiting to hear about a missing woman on the news or something to come up. 2 days ago, I was riding with a friend on the same road, and we saw the same woman crying along the lake shore near that same place. I told them just to keep driving. I talked to some historians in our area to see if they knew anything about stuff like that. There's an old man that covers that side of the county. He mentioned the Morning Lady of the Lake. It is said that she roams the lake crying about how a typhus outbreak took her husband and all 6 children. I was shocked that I had been lucky enough to see her twice, I guess. It freaks me out, but it's still interesting to find that out. Since this occurrence, it has pushed me to look more into area paranormal instances of demons, hauntings, and cryptids. We have this old wives' tale from the locals about whenever thick fog forms along the ground. I never believed any of it. The story goes that when the fog forms, spirits are closer to Earth and can be seen walking. Considering we have a fort from the Civil War that was never used and several cemeteries from the 1800s, everyone is very skeptical. I was driving on a back road last week, and a thick fog rolled in. It's not uncommon for this to happen in early August. It was about 11 p.m. when I passed one of the cemeteries. About 1/3 of a mile up the road, I spotted a figure. There was a woman in a dark gray dress walking along a cornfield with a long braid full of ribbons. There were no farms around for miles. I passed because I've always been taught to be cautious around things like that. Out of curiosity, I turned my car around to see if someone was going to pick her up or if she was lost, but as soon as I pulled up near her, she took a sharp turn into the corn. I brushed it off, waiting to hear about a missing woman on the news or something to come up. 2 days ago, I was riding with a friend on the same road, and we saw the same woman crying along the lake shore near that same place. I told them just to keep driving. I talked to some historians in our area to see if they knew anything about stuff like that. There's an old man that covers that side of the county. He mentioned the Morning Lady of the Lake. It is said that she roams the lake crying about how a typhus outbreak took her husband and all 6 children. I was shocked that I had been lucky enough to see her twice, I guess. It freaks me out, but it's still interesting to find that out. Since this occurrence, it has pushed me to look more into area paranormal instances of demons, hauntings, and cryptids. I was staying in a cabin on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland in the mountains. One day we were snowed in, and when you were snowed in up there, you were stuck. Now, there are plenty of bears and deer up there. We keep salt licks, corn, and all kinds of stuff around, not to hunt but to just feed them. Well, I walked by the back window, which is over the underground garage where we kept snowmobiles and 4-wheelers. I see this big, brownish-looking thing in the woods, probably 50 feet from the cabin, just sitting in the snow. I was shocked because I had never really seen a bear there but had heard the stories about them being around. So I ran to get my mom to show her, and as we walked back to the window, the damn thing stood up. And I don't mean like a bear, I mean like a big, tall man standing up. It then turned around, walked with a huge stride, and took off into the woods. We stood there, shocked. What the hell was that? And my uncle just says, "Oh, that's a Squatch. He's a celebrity around here." I don't know if he was just trying to make us feel better by diffusing the situation with a comedic remark, but after that, I never went into those woods alone again. 2 years ago, I was with my dog, taking him out to go pee. He was being agitated and skittish, which is unlike him. He's a chow/shepherd mix, and he's as much a protector as any other dog. So his attitude this night, in particular, had me on edge as well. I went to join him when I heard him growling, so I stepped out to the side of the house, hearing him absolutely lose it. For a bit of setting, there's a fence around the length of our backyard that also goes about halfway up the sides of the house. The fence has a gate on either side of the house, and there are trees and overgrowth on either side of the house. Stepping out of the house, I noticed something moving in the tree line, so I quickly moved back inside. We have a baseball bat for protection, and I went to get that and came back outside. My dog was still losing it and was staring at the thing I had seen that had not moved. He was growling and snarling, and his ears were pinned and his tail was tucked. Something about this was really ducking him up. So I go down the side fence, letting the bat clink along the chain link, making sure whoever was there knew I was armed. I'm 5 feet 4 inches and look really soft and easy to take on, and I'm not afraid to duck it up. I'm also a bit of an idiot. But I'm not accustomed to scary things, so I was more annoyed than scared. That changed really fast, though. I stood there right behind my dog and looked at this figure, which was standing dead still and had not moved. I considered that there was nothing there, but I wouldn't know until I double-checked. I called out to the figure, telling the person I assumed was there that they needed to get off of private property. They were on my soon-to-be neighbor's land, and I was afraid they had been messing with the construction. Honestly, I assumed it was a teen. But then I heard an owl coo, and I'll be honest, we don't have many of them here where I live. I'm from Ocoee, Florida. So I sort of feel this cold, damp dread spread across my body, and I hesitate, but I pull my phone out and flash the flashlight. I kind of wish I hadn't. Standing there was a figure that was ridiculously tall, I'll say 8 to 10 feet, and thin and wiry. It was all black, something like a hooded robe. It looked heavy, and it didn't hang naturally. I couldn't tell the physical size of the body of this thing because it was so heavily cloaked. But its face was the thing that really threw me for a loop. It had the face of an owl. I don't know what kind of owl it is, but the big black eyes, the beak, the round moon face, it clearly had a pale tan face, and the dark brown feathers around the edges of the face. It did not blink or move when the light hit it. It continued to stand there. I could see its chest rise and fall. My dog barked for the first time with the light on it, and then quickly I turned off the light and moved back inside. I'm a practicing witch, so after that, I quickly worked on protections for the house, my dog, and me, and also cleansed because I felt electrocuted. I've seen it twice since this first time, and my mother has seen it a few times too. She hypothesizes that it's angry about the building on the land there, and I think it's a warning. One day, I was out in the garden with a friend when my partner Bob called our dog Spot. Just his name. Spot started running towards his name, then stopped dead in his tracks. At the same time, it took Spot about a minute to hear his name and run a few steps. I thought, Bob is calling Spot. I wonder why. Wait, was that Bob? The last thought came just as Spot stopped, with one front leg raised mid-step. My friend and I looked at each other, eyebrows raised. Did you just hear that? I asked. Yes, it was Bob calling Spot. My friend replied, a bit dubious. You see, Bob was about 100 yards away, last I knew, and his voice seemed to come from closer and to the right of where I thought he was. Feeling something was off, I yelled, Bob. Did you call Spot? He responded, what? From where I had thought he was and because he's a bit hard of hearing. Trying to be heard, I yelled, Did. You. Call. Spot? To which he replied, Spot. Thinking I was asking him to call the dog. Instantly, Spot takes off, running to Bob. My friend and I look at each other with more eyebrows raised, and we agree that that was weird. 10 minutes later, when Bob joined us in the garden, I asked him if he called Spot. He said, yeah, you told me to, I said, before I yelled to you? He said no, and he thought it was weird that I was asking him to call Spot. I told him what happened, and he immediately guessed that it was a raven mimicking him calling our dog. Then I was dubious, assuming a raven wouldn't sound exactly like him. Or enough alike to fool myself, my friend, and my Spot. Also, we've never heard the ravens talk before. Fast forward 3 weeks when I mentioned to my friend, in a group of people, how I've never been creeped out at our place before but that I can't stop thinking about that. He says, me too. Then, suddenly remembering, he turned to Bob and said, earlier today, when you walked up the hill, did you call for Nick? Referring to his partner, who was also visiting. Bob said, no, I don't think I've ever called for Nick. My friend then relates a similar story to the first one. Hearing Bob call for Nick, but not from where he thought Bob should be, feeling doubtful, then going to find Nick to see if he heard it too. He hadn't. This happened outside. We live in a fairly remote place in Northern California. The national forest borders 3 sides of our property, and we have neighbors to the north of us. None of the neighbors are close enough to hear, and they don't sound like Bob. I looked into cryptids. I was told once that the natives believed an entity lived on the mountain I now live on. Whatever entity is in the mountains is bad. There are 3 cryptic creatures that I know of that will mimic the Wendigo, the Skinwalker, and the Loup-garou. All are bad and only desire to kill. If you hear someone calling you into wooded areas, do not go or answer the other way. I was born and still live in Lewisberry, Pennsylvania. My younger years were spent back near the old observatory, around Moores Mountain Road and Observatory Drive. Even then, I could sense that area was a little off. The woods were just not quite right, the open fields seemed eerie, and the roads never seemed to go the exact places you thought they did. Moores Mountain Church boasted Spook Hollow, which was a logging road that just kind of petered out and reeked of being creepy. Most nights, I will drive down to New Cumberland for a cold beer and some darts, and one night in October 2012 was no different. On the return trip, not long after midnight, I was on Route 382 headed east towards Lewisberry. As I was approaching John Brenneman's place up on the right, just before Brenneman Drive, I saw someone walking towards me along the side of the road. True, it was late, but it was rather mild for October, so it wasn't out of the question that someone might be walking along the road. What was odd is that he was quite tall, 6 feet 6 inches or taller, and really, really thin. In the few seconds I was looking at him, I noticed that he seemed to be dressed all in black, with black pants, a tight black trench coat, very, very dark skin, and short dark hair. He was either limping or having trouble walking. As I debated slowing down, maybe someone had had an accident, he dropped down to all fours and quickly scampered across the road in front of me. He has a face that is, as I said, coal black with a cross between human and canine faces. And then he was gone. When I got home, I hadn't really thought much about it, but over the next day or two, it really started to give me the creeps. I didn't say anything to anyone for a few days, then told a few close friends. Being self-employed and fearing derision, I was reticent to make much ado about it. Although I have always been an enthusiast of the paranormal, cryptozoology, ghosts, and such, I have always been a skeptic. I can't explain what I saw or begin to postulate what it was. I only know I saw it, and it creeps me out. My parents were out of town, and I lived in a small neighborhood in upstate New York. My backyard was half cleared land and half dense woods. There was a small creek that ran behind my house too, so I could see all sorts of animals at night, including turkeys, foxes, possums, raccoons, and deer. One night around 1 a.m., I was on the couch in the extended living room part of my home, where 3 of the walls had windows and we had a skylight. This is important because I had a complete view of almost all of my backyard up to the tree edge, including the moon overhead, which was a wannabe crescent. I heard the sound of a very angry squirrel for about 5 minutes, and I kind of brushed it off because I've heard angry squirrels before. Then I heard the most terrifying screech. It sounded like a goose. I had just been murdered and was screaming. It scared the crap out of me, and I immediately rushed over to the windows to see if I could see anything. I was worried it might have been a wolf since my neighbor's cat likes to go wandering outside and usually kills a bunny or two and leaves them in our front yard. It was pitch black, and my porch light barely illuminated anything but our back porch. I brushed off the noise and went to bed shortly after. The next morning, I headed over to my neighbor's house, who have hunted before and occasionally would bow hunt too. I asked if they heard that noise last night, and they said yes, they thought it was a deer crying for help. They told me they were going to investigate the woods in a few hours to see what had happened. I was reluctant to ask to go, but I was determined to know what the noise had been. A few hours later, my neighbors and I went into the woods. We didn't have to go far when we saw a dead squirrel pretty much ripped to pieces. We continued to figure out that squirrels don't have much meat on them, so the animal probably tried to get as much as it could out of it. We wondered for about 5 more minutes when we came across 5 dead bunnies, a deer and her fawn, and a dead goose. This has frightened me the most. 3 of the dead bunnies had just their heads missing, and their bodies were intact. The other 2 were ripped to pieces, similar to the dead squirrel. I almost gagged at the smell of it all. I didn't dare walk towards the goose or the deer. My neighbor, who had a bow on him, walked towards the mother deer to see that she had long claw marks in her torso and that her head had been mangled. The fawn, however, had its head missing as well. The weirdest part of all of the dead animals was the goose. The goose was fully intact except that its lungs had been ripped open and all of its inner organs were gone. My neighbor's wife immediately called the police and said that there was a bear roaming the property and that he was attacking innocent animals. I had my suspicions, but I do not believe this was a bear. My neighbor, who had the bow, was keeping a clear eye on the surrounding woods, like he was watching for something. His wife paid no attention to this and continued to talk to the police. Then it hit me with a feeling of dread and chills. NY gets cold in the morning, but this was summer, and the humidity was usually around 90%. The entire woods seemed to be silent as well. We were near the creek and couldn't hear the water flowing either. I could see my neighbor had the same feeling wash over him as he raised his bow and loaded an arrow into it. He told his wife to be quiet and me to stand back. I could not see anything, but that feeling was still with me. My neighbor, whom I know, saw something but refused to tell me what it was since I was 15, and he probably didn't want to scare me. After a few minutes, the feeling of dread was gone, and the sound of something moving through the forest could be heard in the distance. My neighbor lowered his bow and told us we had to leave. We immediately listened, and by the time we got back to the small neighborhood, the town police had arrived. My neighbor explained the story, and the police advised us to stay inside. They later sent a few animal control people to survey the area to try and get the bear away from the neighborhood. They came back empty-handed. I never knew what that was that I was out there, but I had done some research, and I believe it might have been a Wendigo by the dead animal killings. My neighbors refused to talk to me about it ever again. And my neighbor, who had the bow, seemed very cautious after that. When I was young, I was camping in the backyard with a friend. Not far from the house, our property extended down into a valley with a wetland surrounding a creek. We were playing cards or something and then heard a terrible sound. The best way I could describe it was a goose getting strangled, then shoved under water, mixed with screams and screeches. We sat there for a short moment before saying that maybe we should go inside. My parents said it was probably the sound of porcupines mating. At the time, I believed it, but I'm sure my parents were just making something up to calm us down. My mom swears she saw cougars down towards the wetland, even though they were supposed to have been hunted out of Pennsylvania. I have a really awful feeling about this. Lately, my visual snow has been acting up, I have been getting awful ringing in my ears, and I have started seeing shadow people again. All usually happen before something awful happens or just passes over. But tonight was so much worse. I have seen shadow people since I was little, but today they absolutely lined the roads. In groups and whatnot. The dog also growled at them, and he never growled at anything. I never heard him growl. On my way home, there were entire groups of, 20 of them that I would see running along. Tonight was also the very first time I was physically affected by them. One was staring me down from about 100 feet away while I walked to my car, and I started to get really dizzy and nauseous. I had a terrible feeling about this. So I was driving home on some dark back roads around 3 a.m. when I had the strangest feeling that someone was in my backseat. I turned on the interior lights, but obviously nobody was there. I kept driving while periodically checking my rearview mirror. I came to a stop sign, looked to my left, and saw a man walking down the road with a flashlight in the distance. I turned right, and after driving about half a mile down the road, I swear I passed the same man walking with a flashlight. Not 20 yards past the man, I stopped at a red light with no cars in sight, just the man walking down the road towards me. I went through the light, and after traveling about another half mile, I checked my rear view mirror, and nothing was there. I glanced down at my phone and immediately looked back at the mirror, and there is a semi-truck on my bumper. This truck looks older and is covered in bright amber lights, but the headlights don't seem to illuminate my car. I would think they would have, considering how close it is. I glanced down again, and when I look back up, the truck is gone. There was absolutely nowhere for the truck to turn off of the road, and even if it did, I would have seen it still in the process of turning in that split second as I glanced down. I came to another stop, and where I would normally go straight to continue on the dark back roads, I decided to take a left and go the longer, well-lit way home. I had just left my mother's house and was driving back to mine down a back road I've driven down many times before. I knew this road like the back of my hand and could drive down it with my eyes closed in reverse. No, I haven't actually done that. As I was getting to the halfway point down this road, there was a thick fog, which is nothing new as there is fog on this road all the time. However, I was driving slowly and starting to take turns I don't remember. There was a 90 degrees right when it should have been left, followed by a wide left turn that felt like a full circle. Then I drove straight for about 5 minutes with no hills or drops, and that road never has a flat section that long. There was then a left turn up a hill, and as I was going up, all the hair stood up on my body, and I almost turned around there, but I decided to keep going, because I'd why. This is when I pulled my gun from my glove box and had it on my lap. When I looked back at the road, some dude was just crouched in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes, and he didn't even flinch. I figured it was just some dude going frog hunting or some shit, as many people on that road do just that. I honked my horn, and the guy stood up. He was massive, like at least 7.5 feet tall, thin as a mother, and his arms were just too long, It looked like he didn't have any clothes on either. I laid on the horn again and clicked the safety on my pistol, just in case. He turned his head what seemed like almost a full 180. And his eyes had that predatory glow, like a wolf or a cat, and I raised my gun and leaned out the window, telling him to get lost. He took a few steps towards me. And I know this was stupid, but I tried to pull the trigger, and my gun just didn't fire. A hammer clicked, and there was no boom. I whipped the car around faster than I've ever done before. I then just flew down the road at least 20 miles per hour over the speed limit. About 30 seconds after I turned around, I realized that I recognized all the turns and hills. I was driving down the road like I had never taken that first right. I went back during the day and still don't know where I took a wrong turn. There are no side streets down that road that are paved, and certainly no straight road as long as the one I drove. I went to the range a day or two later and put that same round in the chamber, and it fired without problem. I have no idea what happened. I also don't drive that way at night anymore. None of my friends believe me, and even my mother doesn't. I know I'm not crazy. I know this happened. This happened 2 days ago. It was about 4 a.m. We were dropping my mother off at the airport for an extended business trip, so we wanted to say goodbye. We're driving. The airport is kind of semi-rural, with lots of swathes of undeveloped land, no lights, etc. The road is nearly empty most of the time if we ride there. It was empty when we saw what we saw. It was a clear night, without clouds. Anyway, we're crossing under an overpass when we all see the exact same thing. A round ball of white and semi-opaque fog, about 3 feet in diameter, whooshing across the highway super fast. It was most definitely not any kind of mammal, as it was like 8 feet off the ground, and it wasn't a bird or whatever, because there was no motion to it. No flapping, gliding, nothing. It was also well lit, and I'm telling you, this thing was just like a fog. That's the best way I can describe it. It was faintly luminescent, kind of like crystal balls in movies, but more fluid, if that makes any sense. The thing zipped across the highway so quickly, easily 60 miles per hour, and this was a large 4-lane highway on both sides. We were all shocked and agreed 100% on the description. A friend and I were spending a beautiful Saturday geocaching in a few of Kentucky's state parks. Our GPS started to not work as we were leaving Carter Cave, and we were looking for a lake, I can't remember the name, in order to find the next cache, but we never found the lake. We were going down these little roads, barely big enough for one car. Our car got chased by a pack of huge dogs, and we were driving by these little metal shacks that made me think of Wrong Turn, Hills Have Eyes, and all those movies that warn people to never leave the real road. Somehow we wound up in far eastern Kentucky, close to the West Virginia border. Before we hit that border, I happened to glance out my window. Of course it was dark, and my friend was beginning to panic because we were in the middle of nowhere, there was no GPS, and the fuel tank was about to hit empty. The moon was bright and full, and then, in the center of what looked like a cornfield, was this huge stone rock or monolith. I have no idea what it was. I turned to my friend and asked, "What is that?" He sped up and didn't say a word. We were following all these little signs and things, and that road took us straight into Huntington, West Virginia. I have not been able to find it since. My girlfriend and I were on our way to work between 4:30 and 5 a.m. this morning. We were driving along and talking as we usually do when I get the feeling to look out the window. I was facing forward and looking at the sides of the roads for animals before this, and as I looked out the window, I saw a looming black figure that was quite large. There wasn't much light on it, but I saw no details as it was blacker, seemed to reflect no light, than anything I have ever seen, even though the grass around it was slightly illuminated. It was like an ill-shaped moose, but in size only. It was also hard to tell if it was on all fours or hunched over. No antlers. My girlfriend was driving, and she asked, "Was that an animal there?" I didn't see it ahead of us. I answered, "Yeah, it must have been." I didn't see it either until it was beside us. We both were suddenly overcome with fear, and the car filled with a very strong smell of blood, the strong iron smell of blood. It was incredibly strong, and we both immediately commented on it and were almost overwhelmed. We have never before or since smelled that in her car, nor have we in any other place. We drove back past on our way home, and again, there was no smell of blood. Even the exhaust from other cars in front of us is barely noticeable when we are in her car compared to mine. I felt her pick up the pace even though we had already passed it by a bit. She was driving around 75 kilometers an hour and sped up to about 80 to 85. The smell eventually dissipated, and we were kind of left scratching our heads. And feeling kind of excited but on edge. We live in a rural town in western Sweden, about 30 kilometers east of Gothenburg. Me and my friend saw this about 2 years ago while creeper hunting. That's what we call our adventures to abandoned and scary places. I really can't remember where we were going that night, but it was like a weird farm area, and there was a barn with old, rusted equipment in it. I believe it was near a bigger, and more heavily guarded, creepy hospital. Now, I have never actually seen any creepers at any of the places we have gone, but ironically enough, my only experience, I think, was while we were driving home from the farm. The roads around there were covered in woods and had nobody on them since it was around 3 in the morning. As we came up to an intersection, we saw a man. Normally, this wouldn't be that weird, but there were no houses in the area that we could see, and he wasn't going anywhere. He was just standing and staring into nothing. The part that stuck out to me, though, was that he was wearing a suit. He was dressed like he was going to a fancy party on the edge of the woods. We were all really freaked out, but we weren't sure if the guy needed help. As we got closer, he didn't move, he just stared at us, so we told our friend to hit and gas and get us out of there. No idea what we saw. My family lived in a nice house in the middle of some dense woods. A few of my friends consistently brought their four-wheelers with them when they came to spend the night. We had a huge yellow four-wheeler and rode pretty much constantly that year. The woods behind my parents' house had trails every which way that snaked around down the hills and to the roads. My friends and I, 11 to 12 years old, had these big plans to get street signs and put them on the trees so that all of our trails would have their names proudly displayed. One day a friend came to stay, and we rode around on the trails for hours. When we became bored of the trails, we took off on the main road to a fire training center about 3 miles away. The fire training center was down a 1-lane gravel road with trees butting up to the sides so close that a car would get scratched going down it. At the end of the road was a pole gate to keep people like us out. On the way there, we passed by a small pickup truck with 2 men in it. When we got to the little trail that went down and around the gate, we saw a dead dog wrapped up in a blanket, blocking the path. We decided to turn around because I didn't want to run over the dog. So we start heading back on the main road, and again, about halfway back, past the small pickup with the men. My friend and I joked that the men are following us because they know we saw the dog they dropped off and didn't bury it the way they should have. We get almost back to my house and decide we can probably find another trail around the dog, maybe on the other side of the gate. So off we go. We turn onto the little gravel road and go to the end. There is no other trail. No other way around. But the dog is kind of laying on half the blanket. So we sit there for a few minutes while I try to convince my friend that if she just tugs on the edge of the blanket, we can move the blanket and dog out of the way without actually touching it. She's not budging, but I really want to ride on the other side of the gate. After a few minutes, it is clear she's not touching the blanket, and so we turn around to head back home. We start back down the gravel road, and after a second, we turn to the straight part. Panic set in quickly. The small pickup is sitting in the road, blocking our only way out. The trees touch both sides of the truck, so there is no going around it. 2 large men sit staring at us. After what feels like forever, I whip the four-wheeler around and go through the trail anyway. We get around the gate into safety. Were they watching me try to persuade her to move the blanket? Could they see us the whole time? Were they still moving until we got to the clear part? What would have happened if I hadn't given up on the blanket? Those questions scare me now as much as they did back then. That gravel road only goes to the fire training center, which is blocked off by a large metal gate. A car that pulls down there is only able to back the entire way back onto the main road. Some 20-odd years ago, I reconnected with a family member. Said family lived way up in the hills of North Carolina and had given me directions to his house. I was driving my vehicle, and my sister was in hers, following behind. We each had CB radios, so we could communicate along the way. We're driving, and I took what I thought was the correct road, and the dirt road immediately climbed at a very steep incline. We slowly make our way up and around this road, and it comes to a dead end. At the dead end was an old, run-down house with a huge front porch. On the porch were a plethora of things, such as an old ironing board leaning against the window, crates of soda pop bottles, a few feed bags, etc. An older gentleman was sitting in a rocker, and he had a long rifle sitting across his lap. To his left was, I assumed, his wife, and she had one of those old-timey wash tubs at her feet, and she was washing clothes. Then there were several barefoot and no-shirt kids running around. Well, they had stopped when we pulled up to the house. And there were, of course, several hound dogs laying around. Every one of them just stopped and stared at us. I slowly rolled my window down and said, very politely, "Excuse me, sir, I think we took a wrong turn." He was slowly rocking in his chair, both hands on the rifle, and just said one, drawn-out word. "Yep." I picked up the CB mic and told my sister, back up now. Back up." And we backed all the way back down to the highway. It's one of the most surreal things I've ever experienced. It was like we drove back in time or something. My friend and I had known each other for quite some time. Most of that time, he lived in town. This is an 8,000-person town, literally in the dead center of Illinois. On the edge of town, on a country highway, there's the remnants of a small pig farm and slaughterhouse, which is now run down. The land on which his family used to hunt in the 80s was Q's 8th grade year, and he tells me he's moving out to the country to a new neighborhood that is being built with upscale homes. His dad had been promoted at the local power plant. This was a mile from the farm or slaughterhouse. I started staying out at his gas station much more than usual because, well, it was awesome. Lots of money went into it. We would explore the woods during the day, as this was about 98 to 99, and would then spend our nights inside listening to music and messing with Yahoo chat groups. Anyway, one day out in the woods, we come across a pond of decent size, and there's a small island in the middle. My friend sees this and immediately goes pale, telling me we've got to go. He hightails it without waiting for me, and I follow. I keep asking what's going on, but he won't answer me. We finally get back to his house, and his parents are sitting in the kitchen. We come in through the garage. They see his face and ask what's wrong. He tells his dad that he found the pond. His dad looks sick, and I again ask what the heck is going on. Now his dad is a pretty straight-laced fellow. He has not really had a sense of humor to speak of since I met him, and he would only enjoy a glass of expensive whiskey when he was in the mood. He decides that now is one of those moods. After getting his glass and taking a sip, he makes us promise to stay away from there and tells us this story. When he was younger, his dad took him and his brother to hunt out there. This incident happened when he was about 19 and well seasoned. They got out early and decided to set up by this pond. Slow day, only a couple deer weren't worth anything. Starting to get the idea that a new spot was needed, they heard a rustling from outside the pond across from them. It was a wolf. But those aren't here. Not a thing in our area. At least not capable of walking to the pond. Looking at it like it was investigating, then stood up on hind legs. I walked that way into the water, swam to the middle, but walked up the island, again on two legs, standing there before lying down and what seemed to be falling asleep. They decided to wait to make sure it was out, then slowly back out, getting back to the truck as quickly as possible. Never going back there to hunt again. Again, this was told to me quite some time ago, but it always stuck with me. My friend's dad never joked with us. He never seemed to have much of a sense of humor at all. Never scared us ever, never made another person laugh. Nobody believed me when I told them this story, but I swear to God it was true. I was in my front yard in Idaho one summer night, smoking a cigarette. There is a warehouse-style aluminum building. I heard some strange noises that sounded like someone banging something against the building or knocking really hard. The building is backed up to the bottom of a mountain. The mountain range goes on for hundreds of miles to the east, with only one sparse town about 40 miles from my house. So I manned up and decided to go investigate. I got over there and had that feeling I was being watched, but I kept heading around to the back of the building to see if I could hear anything else. At this point, I got hit from behind by a spotlight and went, "Oh great, somebody reported me, and now I'm going to have to explain myself to the police." I turned around, fully ready to tell the cop I had heard someone breaking into the building, but there was nothing there. No cop, no source of light, nothing? I fully saw the spotlight hit me and saw my shadow on the building in front of me. I couldn't identify where it had come from, but at this point I had an awful feeling of dread and started back across the street to my house. As I was getting close to the street, I saw what looked like a small dog with really shaggy hair. The hair was so long that it seemed to be covering its eyes. It was so late that I figured it was lost and thought I could go over and check its tag and bring it home. The strange thing was that it was getting up and looking into the windows of an engineering firm. I have never seen a dog get up on its hind legs and look into windows, but I figured it was hungry and looking for food or something. I came really close to it without making a sound because I didn't want it to run off. I knew it must need help. Well, I got just a few feet from this dog before it heard me. It turned and looked at me, and I swear, it had one big eye where its nose should be. I was shocked, to say the least. It almost looked like a totally white skunk with long, shaggy hair. With one big eye right where its nose should be. It went to run, but my hunter instinct kicked in, and I jumped in front of it and went to grab it. I know now this was foolish, but at the time I wanted to capture it or else no one would believe me. It went the other way, but I cut it off again. I went to grab it, but at this point it stood up on its hind legs and let out a sound almost like a cat hissing at me with a weird, almost human-like scream in its voice. At this point, my rational mind kicked in and said, If this thing bites me or attacks me, who knows what might happen? I froze and watched it run off across the pavement and the field, and it didn't make a noise as it ran. I stood there trying to understand what I had just seen and still, to this day, have no idea what it could have been. Along with the spotlight that hit me from the same direction? And its strange behavior looking in the windows of that engineering firm. I'm still, to this day, utterly confused about what the hell it was. I have never heard of another cryptid that matches this description. When I was 6 years old, I lived in a small town in western Washington state. The city is very close to forest areas, and the population is mostly backwoods, country type. In the year 1998, I think, I was living in town. A night came when something strange and unique happened. My child mind couldn't fully grasp what was happening, but neither could the adults who witnessed this. My parents, my grandparents, my uncle, a police officer, and all of our neighbors witnessed a large number of floating or flying green balls of light. They were around softball size, maybe a little bigger. My mother has reminisced about the night and told me about how they chased my grandmother's car up the street and would pace the local traffic. A family friend admitted to seeing them on the nearby highway that night. My family has a very religious background, so their thoughts were that this was sinister and evil, but my memories are different. I vividly remember the green balls connecting in lines of 5 or so and spinning around like a baton and then unlinking to fly freely again. They would hover just above the street, up around the street lights, and just everywhere in between. My mother kept ushering my brother and me inside out of fear, but I was not afraid. This may have been because I was young and unconditioned, but the lights didn't seem dangerous to me. There must have been at least 100 of them. I have had 2 incidents. When I was about 12, me and a load of kids from the neighborhood went to paddle in a lake. It's in the countryside, outside our village. I looked to my left and saw a woman standing on the surface of the lake, about 20 feet away. The water there was about 3 or 4 feet deep, as I checked afterwards. She was dressed in long white robes, which covered her hair too. These robes were gleaming white. She was patting her face with some sort of cloth, as though she were crying. She was as real and solid as you and me, not see-through or anything. In extreme shock, I looked away, and when I looked back a second later, she was gone. It turned out that one other girl saw her too. I had no idea who she was, why she was dressed like that, why she appeared to be crying, or how she could have been standing on the surface of 3-foot deep water. My other one, 3 years later, I was passing a wooded garden, half a mile from my house. It was the priest's house, very old, and in a quiet area. There were no other houses nearby. About 10 feet away from me, a figure was hanging from a tree. It was a male figure who had his back to me. He was right in against the tree trunk, with his arms suspended by his sides. Either he had no head or his head was out of sight. He wore all gray clothes, as though they were from the 70s or 80s, gray trainers, gray work/school uniform trousers, a puffy gray jacket. Again, it was a solid apparition, as real as you and me. I stared at it for literally minutes, taking in every detail. It wasn't a trick of the light or anything. There was no apparent way for him to be hanging there, no visible rope or anything, and the fact that I couldn't see any heads was really creepy. I ran all the way home and burst into tears. My mom believed me. But there were definitely no suicides in the area. It's a teeny rural village in Ireland, and everyone knows everyone. There have been only 2 suicides there ever, and they are still talked about. I had no idea what the hell it was I saw. This is a story that happened to me 18 years ago. When I was 7 years old, I lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Both my parents worked in the mornings, and the school year had just ended, so I was home alone. From the kitchen window, I saw something strange in the trees. A creature of sorts. This creature was about the size of a smart car, sitting about 15 feet up in the tree, and had proportions similar to a gargoyle in both shape and posture. You know how gargoyles sit hunched over with their back legs wider and their front arms or legs close together or touching, minus the wings. No skin was shown. The creature had short bear-like fur mixed with owl-like feathers. The head was massive, with the shape of a bear head and possibly a large beak. I'd many features of the face because I was so fixated on the eyes of this beast. They were huge eyes, the size of basketballs. And the odd thing was that they were blurry looking, like a droopy oil painting. It was an early summer morning, early enough to still be cool but late enough to be clearly lit everywhere. I saw the creature out the kitchen window, ran out onto the front porch, got a better look at it. I wasn't about to go and check it out just yet, and was about 50 yards out. So I went in to grab my father's binoculars, and when I got back to the front porch, the creature was gone, nowhere to be seen. So I, being a brave 7-year-old boy, went out to inspect the area. I saw it. Upon arrival, I saw nothing, no broken branches, markings, or anything. The one thing I remember about the area that was different was that it was dead silent in a forest normally bursting with noise. And there was not a single thing to be heard. And I mean, the forest where I used to live was super loud too, with all sorts of animals making sounds at all times of the day. Super weird. Anywho, I've never heard of any sort of cryptid that matches what I saw that day, and for 18 years, I've been insanely curious. I was driving home late one night. Somewhere between 1 and 3 a.m. the stretch of road I was driving goes through the back end of a couple of counties in the deep south. Nothing around but forests, fields, and the occasional group of shacks huddling under a light that only barely keeps away the night. I'd driven this stretch of road many times before, even at this time of night, so it wasn't really a big deal. It was just a long trip. Since there was rarely any traffic that time of night, during the day you could always count on at least a handful of cars somewhere around. I was able to turn the stereo up and push the pedal down. And then I came to this bridge. There's nothing really noteworthy about it, it's not ancient, a covered bridge, or all that spooky. Just a concrete span over swampland, trees growing right up near the edge and turning the road into a dim trail at the bottom of a dark canyon. I'd been over this bridge many times before, and aside from being fairly long, it wasn't really noteworthy. Until that night. It was humid out, and as the temperature dropped, there was a little bit of fog. Not enough to really slow me down, but I had to turn off the high beams. So I'm shooting across the bridge, and it hits me that it seems to be taking longer than normal to get across it. Maybe I was just tired? Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me? And then, when I thought I was finally getting to the end of it, I saw a figure walking on the opposite side of the road. At first, no big deal, right? Guy is walking in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. Probably lives nearby, probably drunk. Watch them to make sure they don't fall in front of the car. But my mind is already racing. I mean, this is the middle of nowhere. There are no houses around. There are no lights but the stars, and my headlights are stabbing out in the darkness. And as I was going way too fast for my own good, I noticed two things. First, the figure is wearing what appears to be a straitjacket, with the sleeves undone and the straps trailing to the ground. Glaring white against the background of the night, no one is mistaking it. He was in a straitjacket, hands covered, straps dangling, and waving as he walked. Second, it has no face. Not like, there's no head there. There's a head shape. And the place where a face should be, but no face. Just an expanse of darkness that I took to be his skin. I chalked it up to going really fast, the contrast between a white jacket and dark skin at night, and thinking creepy thoughts. I mean, surely I couldn't have just seen that. I tried to spot him in my rearview mirror, but it was so dark that nothing could be seen. I slowed down a little and was suddenly off the end of the bridge and on normal two-lane blacktop again. I briefly considered turning around and seeing what it was. Surely it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. Right? But I still remember my heart pounding and my fear as I sped on through the darkness, driving home. This story happened to me about 12 years ago. I was around 24 at the time. I worked in hospitality, so it'd be later at night when my friends and I hung out. So, at around 9 o'clock, my friend and I decided to go for a drive, someplace we've never been. Just get in the car and go. I offered to drive because my mother was out of town. He happily agreed, and we hit the road. We lived near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at the time. We drive north out of the city and drive for about an hour when I see an exit I don't recognize and decide to get off there. There was nothing at this exit other than cornfields, no gas station or restaurant signs, no visible light of a town in any direction. So we are in a place we don't recognize, but that was the point, just driving to get nowhere because the speed limit was 35 and we were in no rush. The moon was out enough that everything was pretty visible. About a mile into the cornfields, we could see two kids on the right side of the road. We comment on how weird it is because there is no housing, stores, or even lights on the horizon, plus it was 10:30ish at night. Naturally, there were two larger guys, so we don't worry about anything, so I slowed down so we can inquire if their car broke down or if they were okay. As we pulled up, I noticed the kid in front. He appeared to be maybe 12 years old. The second kid was taller. I could barely notice the taller kid standing further behind the smaller one because, as I pulled up, noticing the clothes, I got to see the whole child fully, and his arms were slightly raised to his side, almost in that iconic zombie way. But with his eyes, I couldn't take my eyes off of his, and I did my best to mutter to my friend, "You're seeing this too, right?" His eyes were pitch black, blacker than the night, but easy to see as he stood there staring at us. I did not know what the heck I was seeing, but I've never been so frightened in my life, and I've had several odd experiences that have left me unable to deny that there is more in this world than what we understand. So we're stopped for a moment, locking eyes with whatever this thing was. It was no child, it was evil, and I have zero doubts about that. We quickly agreed to go. We are not going to inquire with them. This was straight out of the Twilight Zone, and I remembered the hitchhiker, and that was not happening tonight, sir. So, we go, and we clamor between ourselves. What was that? What the hell was that? Still no signs of homes, just open cornfields. How these two kids could be there, I don't know, but I believe they were not kids. So I keep driving, and we get out of the fields onto a wooded, windy road shortly after, probably around 5 minutes. Here in Wisconsin, there are random historical markers displaying information about whatever year this happened. I only mention that because I passed one on the curve, so I glanced at that. As I'm driving through a curve going about 45 miles per hour, a creature walks in front of my car, my mom's car. As I saw it, it was nothing like I'd ever seen. Its spine was tall, and it stuck above the hood ornament as I hit it. It was a gray color and looked like nothing I've ever seen. It had a very tall arch in its spine, almost like when a cat hisses and goes on its toes, that kind of shape, but in a very tall, gangly creature. I hit this thing straight on with the tank of a Benz. My friend is freaked out at this point, as am I, to say the least. I stop immediately, but now we're both a bit scared of the children of the corn. And now this thing literally happens within minutes of one another. We decide getting out is not going to happen, but I decide to stay in the locked car but use the car and its lights to see what we hit and make sure whatever the hell it was is dead, and I needed to know what I just saw. I drive in tiny circles, backing up and forward, looking for this creature, but after checking every inch within 100 yards and not seeing a thing, including not a drop of blood where I hit it, I drive straight on with a Benz, making contact with its spine, body, and head anywhere. That was unnerving. And although I wanted to check my mother's car, that would be dealt with further down the road. We were not going to get out there. So we decided to head home at this point. 15 minutes later, I got back to the motorway, and I needed to get out and see how bad the car was. As I got out to check quickly, as I was not taking chances tonight, I noticed my grill was busted in, but nothing too bad. So I made sure it was secure and got back in as quickly as possible. My friend decided to stay inside the car. Recently, I heard of the black-eyed kids and freaked out a little bit. I did not know that they were a real thing. I thought I just saw a couple demon kids or damned ghosts, or I didn't know what to think. To this day, I've looked through tons of photos of supposed cryptid beasts and mythological creatures looking for what I hit, and the closest I've found is some Algonquin drawings of Wendigos, and they were very close to what I believe I saw and hit that night. It seems to me very odd that both things could happen so close to one another to not be related. I just got home from a road trip, and I've been thinking about something I saw and can't make sense of it. Maybe some of you have also seen something like this. My wife and I were driving on Highway 97 south near Mount Shasta, CA. It was about midnight, and we were driving through a heavily wooded area without any street lamps. We rounded a corner when I saw something fast and low to the ground dart across the street about 50 to 60 yards ahead of us. I saw glowing animal eyes and a body that was the size and shape of a big dog. We saw animals the whole road trip, and like usual, I asked my wife if she saw them too, and she confirmed. The body wasn't 100% clear because our headlights hadn't reached that section of the road yet. When we got to the exact point on the road where the animal crossed, we looked to that side to see if there was anything there. There was a man dressed in army fatigues walking down the road. He didn't look at us, he just kept walking. It was pitch black, and he didn't have any type of light with him. He was only lit up by our headlights. We both got full body chills when we saw him because we were expecting to see an animal. I know that area has a magical or mystical history with a lot of unexplained sightings. This is unlike anything I have ever experienced before. We were fully creeped out. I still can't make heads or tails of this. I live in northeastern America in a pretty rural place with lots of hills, not too many neighbors, and a lot of forest. Just tonight, I was headed with my mother down our backyard, which is large and relatively clear for about 100 feet, then switched to woods. We got about 30 feet before the woods, and I caught sight of some eyes reflecting in my headlamp. They were a good 50 to 100 feet away, and I assumed they were just deer, but a few things convinced me they might not be. Around where I live, deer will run away if you make enough noise, and we were talking pretty loudly, but the eyes weren't moving. They kept staring directly at us, which is incredibly unlike deer in this area. On top of that, the pair of eyes on the right were very low to the ground and very wide, too far apart to be deer considering the distance. We stood for a minute, remarking on them, and neither pair of eyes looked away. So, since we were spooked, we headed back up to the house, got my brother a machete, a bat, and a metal pole. I know, a little overkill, but our area has been a little scary lately, and headed back down. I expected the eyes to be gone by that point, but no, they were still there in slightly different spots than they had been, but not much further from where they were previously. They stared just as steadily as they had before, so we retreated back inside. The logical answer is deer, but the lack of running away, intent staring, and wide-set eyes feel like that option is ruled out. Another thought is wild dogs, but we don't usually have those in our area. It is possible to be a black bear, but those are notoriously scared of people. If anyone has any thoughts on what it might be. I recently had an experience driving through Germany that I'll never forget. It was terrifying and unbelievable. I was alone on a road trip, driving through Germany at night with no other cars in sight. The roads were winding and narrow, and I was completely focused on staying safe. Suddenly, I saw something moving in the distance, and before I could even react, it was right in front of my car. It was a figure dressed in a long black cloak, with a hood covering their face. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell that this person was up to no good. I swerved to avoid them, but they seemed to follow me, running alongside my car even though I was going over 100 kilometers per hour. They were keeping up, which was strange considering the speed I was going. I had never seen anything like it before. That's when it hit me that this person might not be human. I had heard stories about the infamous black ghost of German folklore, a supernatural entity that reportedly haunts the roads of rural Germany. Was this really happening to me? Terrified and unsure of what to do, I sped up and focused on the road ahead. The figure eventually disappeared, and I was left alone on the road once again. I don't know what I saw that night, but I'm convinced it was something otherworldly. I used to organize backpacking trips for my friends in the ADK. In order to ensure a good Lento, I'd insist that both cars of people leave on Wednesday evening, from Buffalo, to arrive early Thursday morning, sleeping through that day and driving through the night. I had done this drive 4 to 5 times before, and the only time we didn't get out, our first choice was Avalanche Lake. One time we were on Highway 3 going east somewhere between Star Lake and Cranberry Lake. The sun was rising but was still not visible in the sky. All 4 passengers in my VW Rabbit were napping, and I was listening to a Coast to Coast special with a woman who claims to speak to the dead, and in particular, Sigmund Freud. This was all very interesting to me after 2 Red Bulls. Freud really had a lot of things he wanted to tell us from beyond the grave, and as usual, George was pulling out a narrative from his guest's nonsensical ramblings. The only other car I had seen for miles was my friend driving behind us. We had stopped to take an emergency urination a few miles back, which gave us a much-needed second wind. Suddenly, I saw something very large and very brown bolt across the road. This creature was larger than my car and gravely misjudged both my speed and its speed, almost plowing into my driver's side door. I locked eyes with the behemoth as I swerved off the road, maintaining control of the car but waking everyone up abruptly. To this day, no one but the driver of the car behind me believes what I saw in the woods that evening, a huge female moose. So this happened to me about 4 months ago. Background: me and my fiancée went to Colorado for an anniversary getaway, where I popped the question and asked her to marry me. I was from Kentucky, so it was going to be a 16-17 hour car ride. We got there, and it was beautiful and great, and we got engaged and had a good time. So come the day we leave, we get on the road at about 12 and drive through the night. I was about 2.5 hours away from home in the back roads of Indiana. The GPS took us some questionable ways, and I was driving the last leg of the trip while my fiancée slept a little. It's about 4 to 5 a.m. at this point, and the sun was just starting to show over the horizon. As I drove down a narrow, curvy road, I started to notice a car had been following me for a nice while, and I got just a tad weird as I didn't have my firearm on me and we were in Hickville. I thought I was just being paranoid and tried ignoring the car. So I see an extra curvy road coming up, and next thing I know, the car that was behind me gets right up on my bumper and flicks its lights on. But 30 seconds later, after coming around a curve, I see 4 sets of tires sitting on the road, kind of like a roadblock. I had no time to stop and didn't plan on it. I ran over the tires and felt a pretty heavy smack and bump. And right as I turned the next corner, trying to speed up and get away from the car still on my ass, I glance over and see about 5 to 7 people crouching on the side of the road in some bushes. The sun was behind them and kind of lit them up. At this point, I know I'm in some type of danger, so I floor it and start doing almost 100 miles per hour on this curvy back road. Seeing that I didn't stop and my tire didn't go flat, the car behind me slowed and eventually went out of sight. My fiancée slept through the whole thing, and when we went to the next gas station to fill up, I saw about 5 to 6 nails in all 4 of my tires and a nice chunk of rubber missing. At this point, my fiancée was awake, and the last thing I wanted to do was ruin her engagement trip by telling her what happened. So I never did. I took the car back to the rental office and went on my way. Riverdale Road, Colorado, so it's March 18, 2020. It was around 8:15-ish when my girlfriend and I hung out. At the moment, I don't have a car, so she lets me drive, but she comes and gets me and offers me to drive, so I say yes, of course. As we are driving with no destination, we are just talking and laughing, just a normal night. Fast forward 30 minutes. We are on I-25, and I think I truly can't remember. Well, as we are going, we pass the exit for Fort Morgan and probably go another 2 to 10 miles past. Keep in mind that I've never been in this area before, and it's dark outside. Eventually I get off at some exit, and here is when things get weird and paranormal. I don't remember anything from the time I got off the highway to what I was about to tell you. We end up in Riverdale. We are right next to Riverdale High School, so we are driving without thinking too much about anything because, like I said, I've never been in Riverdale, Colorado, before. I ask my girlfriend if I should turn left or right, and she says right and automatically changes her mind and says left, so we laugh because it's too late and I already made the turn. As we are going, there is probably a half mile of pure darkness and just a road that goes downhill, then back uphill, and then straight. As soon as we turned, I automatically felt like this weird, just eerie bad energy, so I quickly asked my girlfriend if she felt it too, and she said she does. As we start to go downhill, I feel these startling chills going down my spine, and I can't control it at all. On the right side of the road, there is a hill with a tree and a light, probably the creepiest thing I've ever seen. My girlfriend starts telling me she doesn't like it, and we have to go. As we reach the end, I read the street sign, and it says Riverdale. I told her I remembered reading something about a Riverdale being haunted, but I didn't think it was in Colorado. I tell her to look it up and that we are going to drive through it again. At this point, we are turning to go down it again, and my girlfriend looks at me and says, "We just went down the most considered haunted road in the country." At this point, it's too late, so we go down it again. This is when things get really intense, as if they weren't already bad enough. We hear like a scream of some sort, and we both freak out a little more, so I hit the gas, and we go through it faster than we did the first time. I automatically turn right and try to get out of there. I have no idea where I am. So she pulls up directions on her phone, and we are slowly starting to calm down, but I wasn't paying attention and missed my turn, and we were headed directly back to the road again, and instantly I got goosebumps and cold chills down my spine again. I tell my girlfriend we have to go again, and right as I said, a black cat runs across the road, and that did it for me. I whipped the car around and floored it to the correct turn, but as we were going, I realized there was a handprint on her window near the mirror. And no one had touched the window, and I know for a fact it wasn't me because I drove with my left hand and my right hand was holding her hand. As we are leaving this freaky, eerie place, I stop at the stop sign, and as I drive forward, there is this high-pitched sound, and my girlfriend's car starts shaking. I hit the gas and went 90 out there. I plan on going back at some point. I believe the exact road I went down was E. 136th Avenue, which is near Riverdale Ridge High School. I went somewhere between 9 and 10 p.m.